The Iron Heart of Summer. Will Holt was dying when the children found him. Not from the bullet still lodged in his shoulder, though infection had turned the wound black. Not from the whiskey he'd been drowning in since his wife's grave went cold. He was dying from the inside out, from grief so heavy it had crushed every reason to draw another breath. His homestead was collapsing around him, fences down, animals scattered. The house his wife never got to fill with babies, now just a tomb for one ghost of a man. Then two shadows appeared through the heat shimmer, walking straight toward his porch, like destiny wouldn't take no for an answer. What happened next would either save them all or bury them together. If you want to see how a dying man and two abandoned children became the family nobody expected, stay with me until the end, and drop a comment with your city so I can see how far this story travels. The summer of 1881 came to the Nebraska plains like a punishment. By mid-June, the grass had turned from green to yellow to brown, crunching underfoot like old bones. The sky stretched wide and merciless, bleached almost white by a sun that rose angry and set angry, offering no relief between. Heat waves shimmered across the prairie, bending the horizon into something liquid and uncertain, making a man question what was real and what was just his mind playing tricks after too many days alone. Will Holt sat on the sagging porch of his homestead, a half-empty whiskey bottle dangling from fingers that barely bothered to grip anymore. His left shoulder throbbed with a deep, poisonous heat that had nothing to do with the weather. 3 weeks since the bullet went in. 2 weeks since he'd stopped trying to dig it out. The flesh had turned the color of spoiled meat, black at the edges, weeping yellow when he moved wrong. He should ride to town, find the doctor, get it cleaned before the rot took his whole arm. He took another drink instead. The porch boards groaned under his weight, half of them split or missing entirely. The railing had collapsed last winter. The steps had given up the year before that. Everything about this place was falling apart, piece by piece, like his life had been doing since the day they buried Catherine. Catherine with her auburn hair and quick laugh. Catherine who'd been 6 months heavy with their first child when the fever came through. Catherine who'd whispered his name one last time before the light went out of her eyes, taking every good thing in his world with her. That was 18 months ago, felt like 18 years. Will shifted, and the movement sent fire shooting through his shoulder. He grunted, pressed his right hand against the wound, felt the heat radiating through his shirt. Infected, badly. He knew enough to recognize that. His father had been a horse doctor before he was anything else, had taught Will how to read a wound, how to know when flesh was fighting and when it was surrendering. This flesh had surrendered. He should care about that. He didn't. The whiskey was cheap and burned going down, but it was the only thing that dulled the edges anymore. Not the pain in his shoulder. That was beyond dulling now. But the other pain, the kind that lived in his chest where his heart used to be, the kind that woke him at night with Catherine's name on his lips and the phantom sound of a baby crying in empty rooms. That pain, the whiskey could touch. Sometimes. A hot wind gusted across the yard, kicking up dust devils that spun and died against the barn. The barn door hung crooked on one hinge. The chicken coop had been empty for months. The garden Catherine had planted was now just a patch of weeds and dried stalks, mocking him every time he looked at it. He'd let it all go to hell, let himself go with it. What was the point? A man didn't build a homestead for himself. He built it for a family, for children who'd carry his name into the future, for a wife who'd make the house something more than just walls and a roof. Without that, it was just labor. Just suffering stretched across years until your back broke and the land buried you. Will closed his eyes against the glare. The whiskey sloshed in the bottle. His shoulder pulsed with infection. The sun hammered down without mercy. He was ready to stop. Just stop. Then he heard it. Footsteps. Not the heavy tread of a man or the quick clip of a horse. Light steps. Deliberate. Coming closer. Will opened his eyes, squinting against the brightness. Two figures emerged from the heat shimmer at the edge of his property, walking up the long approach to the house. Small figures. Children. He blinked, wondering if the fever had finally taken his mind. But they kept coming. A girl and a boy, he realized as they drew near. The girl was maybe 10, thin as a fence post, wearing a dress that had once been blue but was now sun-faded to gray. Her dark hair hung in 2 braids down her back, and she walked with the kind of purposeful stride that belonged to someone much older. The boy beside her was smaller, 6, maybe 7, with shaggy brown hair and eyes too big for his face. He clutched a burlap sack against his chest like it contained everything he owned. Probably did. Will watched them come, too surprised to move, too tired to care. They crossed his yard without hesitation, stepping over broken fence rails and around patches of thistle, heading straight for the porch. The girl stopped at the bottom of the ruined steps. Her eyes were gray, hard as river stones, and when she looked at Will, she didn't flinch from what she saw, a drunk man with a rotting shoulder and nothing left to give. "Mister," she said. Her voice was steady, flat. No tremor, no plea. "We need water." Will stared at her, then at the boy, who hadn't spoken, just stood there gripping his sack and staring at the ground. "Well's around back," Will said finally, his voice rough from disuse. "Help yourself." The girl's jaw tightened. "We need food too, and a place to sleep." Something sharp moved through Will's chest. Not quite anger, not quite pity, something in between. "This look like a hotel to you?" he asked. "No, sir." The girl's chin lifted. "But you got a barn. We won't be trouble. We can work." "Work?" Will almost laughed. "Doing what?" "Whatever needs doing." She gestured at the sagging porch, the broken fence, the weed-choked yard. "Looks like there's plenty." The boy still hadn't looked up, just stood there, silent and small, like he'd learned that being invisible was the safest way to exist. Will recognized that look. "Where's your folks?" he asked. "Dead." The girl said it without inflection, like she was reporting the weather. "Mama died 4 days ago. Fever, we got nobody else. Town's got an orphanage. Town don't want us." Her eyes stayed level. "Said we're too old to place. Told us to figure it out." Will's stomach turned. He knew the orphanage she meant. A grim building run by a woman with a hard mouth and harder rules. She took infants sometimes, toddlers if they were pretty and quiet. But older children? Children who could talk back, who remembered their parents, who'd already learned that the world was cruel? No profit in that. "So you walked out here," Will said. "Saw smoke from your chimney last week when we were in town. Figured somebody was living here." The girl shifted her weight. "We won't steal, won't cause trouble. Just need a roof and some food until we can figure something else." Will looked at her, really looked. Beneath the dirt and the hard expression, she was just a child, scared and trying not to show it, doing what she had to do to keep her brother alive. He knew that kind of courage. His wife had it once, right up until the end. "What's your name?" he asked. "Marin." She touched the boy's shoulder. "This is Eli." Eli didn't look up. Will sighed, a sound that came from somewhere deep and tired. He shouldn't do this. He could barely take care of himself. He was halfway to the grave already, just waiting for the infection or the whiskey to finish the job. These children needed someone strong, someone stable, someone who wasn't drinking himself to death on a collapsing porch. But the words came out anyway. "Barn's got holes in the roof. You'll get rained on." Marin's expression didn't change. "We've slept in worse." "I'm sure you have." Will pushed himself to his feet, swaying slightly as pain lanced through his shoulder. "Come on, I'll show you inside." The house was worse than the barn. Will saw it through their eyes as they stepped across the threshold, dust thick on every surface, dishes piled in the basin, his bedroll thrown in a corner like he'd just given up on the idea of a proper bed. The windows were filmed with grime. The floor hadn't been swept in months. Catherine's rocking chair sat by the cold fireplace, covered in cobwebs. He hadn't been able to move it. Couldn't bear to. Marin took it all in without comment. Eli stayed close to her side, his eyes darting around like he expected something to jump out at him. "There's a spare room," Will said, nodding toward the back. "Was supposed to be—" He stopped himself. "Doesn't matter. You can sleep there." Marin nodded. "Thank you." "Don't thank me yet." Will moved toward the kitchen, moving carefully to avoid jarring his shoulder. "Haven't got much in the way of food. Some beans, hardtack, little bit of salt pork." "We can stretch it," Marin said. "I know how to cook." "I'm sure you do." Will pulled a tin of beans from the shelf, set it on the table. "You eaten today?" "No, sir." "Then get to it." He found a pot, mostly clean, and set it beside the beans. "I'll get a fire going." He expected her to hesitate, to wait for more instruction, but Marin moved with the efficiency of someone who'd been cooking for herself and her brother for a long time. She found the water bucket, filled the pot, set the beans to soak. Eli finally set down his sack and stood by the table, watching everything with those two wide eyes. Will crouched by the fireplace, started building a fire with hands that shook slightly. The fever was getting worse. He could feel it in his bones, in the way his thoughts kept sliding sideways. "Mister?" He looked up. Marin was watching him with that steady, measuring gaze. "That wound in your shoulder," she said quietly. "It's bad." "I know. Needs cleaning, needs proper tending." "I know that too." "Then why haven't you done it?" Will stared at her for a long moment. Then he turned back to the fire, struck the flint, watched the kindling catch. "Because I didn't have a reason to," he said. The fire grew. Marin said nothing, but when Will finally stood and turned around, he found her laying out their supper with careful hands, like it mattered, like this broken-down house with its drunk, dying owner was worth the effort. Maybe it was the fever. Maybe it was the way Eli had finally looked up, just for a second, his eyes finding Will's with something that might have been hope. Maybe it was just that he was tired of dying alone. "After we eat," Will said quietly, "I'll need you to help me with something." Marin met his eyes, nodded once. "Yes, sir, son." The beans were bland, but they were hot, and that was enough. They ate in silence, the three of them sitting around the scarred kitchen table while evening light slanted through the dirty windows. Eli ate like he was afraid the food would disappear if he didn't finish fast enough. Marin ate methodically, her eyes flicking between her brother and Will, always watching, always assessing. When the meal was done, Will pushed back from the table and unbuttoned his shirt. "I'm going to need you to be steady," he told Marin. She nodded, her face pale but determined. Will peeled the shirt away from his shoulder, and the smell hit immediately, sweet and rotten, the stink of flesh going bad. The wound was a puckered mess, black at the edges, leaking fluid that had soaked through his undershirt. He'd wrapped it with a strip of old cloth days ago, but that had just trapped the infection, let it fester. Marin didn't gag, didn't look away. "What do you need?" she asked. "Whiskey, clean cloth, ikaposit, knife from the drawer." Will sat down heavily. "And you're going to have to cut away the bad flesh." "I've never You've butchered chickens." "Yes, sir." "Same principle. Just cut until you hit pink." He met her eyes. "It's going to hurt. I'm going to make noise. Don't stop. Understand?" Marin swallowed hard, then she stood, moved to gather what he'd asked for. Eli watched from his chair, his face drained of color. "It's all right, boy," Will said, trying for a reassuring tone and landing somewhere near exhausted. "I've had worse." That was a lie. But the kid didn't need to know that. Marin returned with the supplies, her hands shaking slightly as she set them on the table. Will took a long pull from the whiskey bottle, felt the burn all the way down, then handed it to her. "Pour it over the wound first," he said, "then start cutting." She nodded, uncorked the bottle, looked at him once more. "Do it," Will said. The whiskey hit the wound like liquid fire. Will's vision went white. His teeth clamped together so hard he thought they'd crack. Every muscle in his body locked up, and for a few seconds he couldn't breathe, couldn't think, could only endure as the alcohol seared through infected flesh. Then Marin's voice, quiet and steady. "I'm starting now." The knife touched his skin. Will's hands gripped the edge of the table, knuckles white. He could feel the blade slicing through the dead tissue, peeling it away from healthy flesh beneath. Marin worked with surprising precision, her small hands steady, cutting away the worst of the infection in careful strips. It took forever. It took seconds. Time stopped meaning anything beyond the bright, terrible pain and the sound of his own breathing, harsh and ragged in the quiet kitchen. When she finally stopped, Will's shirt was soaked with sweat, his head swimming. "It's done," Marin said softly. Will forced his eyes open, looked down at his shoulder. The wound was raw, bleeding, but the black was gone. What remained was angry red, but it was clean. It would heal now, if he let it. Good, he managed. Now bind it, tight. Marin wrapped the clean cloth around his shoulder with the same careful attention she'd given everything else. When she tied it off, Will finally let himself slump back in the chair, exhausted beyond words. Thank you, he said. You're welcome. Marin set the knife aside, her hands finally trembling now that it was over. You should rest. So should you. But neither of them moved. They sat there in the growing darkness, the three of them, while outside the summer wind rattled the loose boards, and somewhere in the distance a coyote called to the rising moon. Will woke to the smell of coffee. For a moment he thought he was dreaming, or dead, because the last time coffee had been made in this house, Catherine had been the one making it, humming while she worked, her belly round with the baby they'd never meet. But then consciousness fully returned, and he remembered the children, Marin and Eli. He sat up slowly, testing his shoulder. It hurt. Hurt like hell, actually. But it was a clean hurt now. The fever had broken sometime in the night, leaving him weak but clear-headed for the first time in weeks. Morning light streamed through the kitchen window. Someone had wiped the glass clean. Will stood, pulled on a fresh shirt from the trunk he hadn't opened in months, and walked into the kitchen. Marin stood at the stove pouring coffee into 2 tin cups. Eli was at the table, eating what looked like cornmeal mush. The dishes from last night had been washed and stacked. The floor had been swept. The cobwebs were gone from Catherine's rocking chair. Marin looked up when he entered. Morning. Morning. Will took the coffee she offered, still trying to process the transformation. You didn't have to do all this. We agreed to work, Marin said simply. This is work. Will looked at her, at Eli, who was watching him with slightly less fear than yesterday, at the clean kitchen that suddenly felt less like a tomb and more like something else. How old are you? He asked Marin. 10, almost 11. And you? Eli's mouth opened, closed. He looked at his sister. He doesn't talk much, Marin said quietly. Not since Mama died, but he's 7. He talked before that? Yes, sir. He will again, just needs time. Will nodded slowly, sipped the coffee. It was strong, bitter, exactly how he liked it. Well, he said finally, since you're so eager to work, there's plenty needs doing around here. We know. Marin's chin came up. We walked the property this morning. The fence is down in 3 places. The barn needs patching. The well cover's rotted through. All right. Will held up a hand, fighting a smile that felt foreign on his face. I get the picture. Place is falling apart. Yes, sir. Then I guess we better get started. He expected questions, expected resistance, expected something other than the immediate businesslike nod Marin gave him. What first? She asked. Will looked out the window at his failing homestead, at the fences he'd let collapse and the barn he'd let rot and the garden he'd let die. A month ago, hell, yesterday, he would have said it wasn't worth saving, that he'd rather let it all fall and take him with it. But something had shifted. Maybe it was the clean wound in his shoulder. Maybe it was the smell of coffee he hadn't made himself. Maybe it was the way Eli was watching him, like Will might actually be someone worth watching. The fence, he said. We'll start with the fence. The sun climbed higher as they worked. Will showed Marin how to dig a proper post hole, how to set the cedar logs deep enough that winter frost wouldn't push them out. She learned fast, her thin arms stronger than they looked. Eli followed them around the property line, carrying tools, fetching water, never speaking but always present. By noon, they'd repaired 1 section of fence. It wasn't pretty, but it was solid. They broke for a meal of cold beans and hardtack, eating in the shade of the barn while the prairie wind offered brief relief from the heat. Will watched the children eat, saw the way Marin portioned everything carefully, making sure Eli got the larger share. How long were you on your own? He asked. Before you came here. Marin wiped her mouth with the back of her hand. 4 days after Mama passed. 3 days walking to find your place. Walking from where? Town, Plum Creek. Will's eyebrows rose. That's near 15 miles. 13, Marin corrected. We counted fence posts. Jesus. Will shook his head. You walked 13 miles in this heat with no food or water? We had a canteen and some bread from the church lady. It ran out the second day. She said it matter-of-factly, like she was describing the weather. We managed. You could have died. We could have died in town, too. Marin's gray eyes met his. At least this way we had a chance. Will didn't have an answer for that. They finished the meal in silence, then went back to work. The afternoon stretched long and brutal, the sun hammering down without mercy. Will's shoulder ached, but he pushed through it, driven by something he couldn't quite name. Marin worked beside him without complaint. Eli hauled water from the well, making trip after trip without being asked. By evening, they'd finished 2 full sections of fence. By sunset, Will was exhausted in a way that felt different from the whiskey-soaked fatigue he'd been drowning in for months. This was honest tiredness, earned through labor and sweat. It felt good. "That's enough for today," he said, driving the last post home. "Let's get cleaned up." They walked back to the house together, 3 figures against the orange sky, their shadows stretching long across the prairie grass. Inside, Marin heated water for washing while Will found more food. Dried apples this time, and a small piece of cheese he'd forgotten about in the cold box. They ate at the table again, the routine already settling into something familiar. When the meal was done, Eli's eyes were drooping, his small body swaying with exhaustion. "Get him to bed," Will told Marin. "You too. Morning comes early." Marin nodded, helped her brother to the back room. Will heard the sounds of settling, blankets rustling, quiet murmurs, then silence. He stood alone in the kitchen, looking around at the space that had felt so empty for so long. It didn't feel empty anymore. Will walked to Catherine's rocking chair, the one he hadn't been able to touch, couldn't bear to move. He ran his hand along the smooth wooden arm, remembering her sitting here by the fire, knitting tiny clothes for a baby who never came. "I don't know what I'm doing," he said quietly to the empty air, to Catherine's ghost, to whatever God might be listening. "They're just children. They need more than I got to give." The chair creaked slightly in the evening breeze from the open window. Will stood there a moment longer, then turned and headed for his own bedroll. Tomorrow would bring more work, more challenges, more reasons to keep going. For the first time in 18 months, that didn't sound like a burden. It sounded like a purpose. The days began to blend together, marked by sunrise and sunset, by fence posts set and boards nailed, by slow, steady progress. Will's shoulder healed, the clean wound closing properly, the infection finally driven out by Marin's careful tending and his own stubborn refusal to let it kill him. His hands, soft from months of disuse, grew calloused again. His back straightened. The whiskey bottle stayed on the shelf more often than not. Marin proved herself 10 times over. She could cook with almost nothing, turning dried beans and a handful of wild onions into something almost good. She knew how to conserve water, how to patch clothes until they held together one more season, how to make a little bit of everything stretch further than it had any right to. But it was the other things Will noticed most, the way she checked the horizon every morning like she was expecting trouble, the way she counted their supplies with the precision of someone who'd gone hungry before. The way she positioned herself between Eli and the world, always ready to protect him from whatever came next. She was 10 years old and already harder than most men Will knew. It broke his heart a little. Eli remained silent, but slowly, so slowly Will almost missed it happening, the fear in his eyes began to fade. He started bringing Will tools without being asked. Started sitting on the porch in the evenings, watching the sunset with something that might have been peace. Sometimes, when he thought no one was looking, he'd smile at something Marin said, or at the barn cat that had started coming around for scraps. 3 weeks after the children arrived, Will found Eli in the barn, standing in front of the old mare Will had stopped riding months ago. The horse was gray, gentle, half-blind in one eye, but steady as stone. Eli had his hand stretched out, palm flat, offering a handful of oats. Will watched from the doorway as the mare lipped the oats from the boy's small hand, her soft muzzle barely touching his skin. Eli's face lit up, not with a smile exactly, but with something tentative and fragile and impossibly precious. Wonder. "Her name's Sadie," Will said quietly. Eli jumped, pulled his hand back, eyes wide. "It's all right," Will said, stepping into the barn. "She likes you, can tell." Eli looked at the horse, at Will. back at the horse. You want a brusher? Will asked. A hesitation, then a nod. Will found the brush, handed it to Eli, showed him how to move it along the horse's coat in long, smooth strokes. The boy's movements were tentative at first, then grew more confident as Sadie stood patiently, clearly enjoying the attention. She's yours if you want her, Will said after a while. Eli's head snapped up, eyes questioning. To take care of, Will clarified. Every morning and evening. Feed her, brush her, keep her stall clean. Think you can do that? Eli's mouth opened. For a second, Will thought he might actually speak, but then the moment passed, and the boy just nodded vigorously, his whole face bright with something that looked like hope. All right then. Will clapped him gently on the shoulder. She's yours. That evening, Marin found Will on the porch as the sun was setting. Thank you, she said quietly. For the horse, for all of it. He earned it, Will replied. Works hard, deserves something of his own. Marin was quiet for a moment, then, how long can we stay? The question hung in the air between them. Will had been expecting it, but that didn't make it easier to answer. That depends, he said finally. On what? On whether you want to. Marin's head turned sharply. What? You heard me. Will kept his gaze on the horizon. This place needs work. Probably more work than one man and two children can manage. But I'm willing to try if you are. Winter's coming in a few months. If we're smart, we can get the barn sealed, the house reinforced, enough wood cut to keep us warm. He paused. I'm not saying it'll be easy, and I'm not saying I'm any good at this, but I'm saying, if you want to stay, you can stay. Marin didn't answer right away. When Will finally looked at her, he saw tears tracking down her dusty cheeks, though her face remained composed. We want to stay, she whispered. Then stay. It was that simple, that complicated, that final. They sat together in the growing darkness, watching the first stars appear, while inside Eli sang softly to himself, the first sound Will had heard him make beyond breathing, the sound of a child who felt safe enough to remember how. Summer deepened into August, and with it came a rhythm that felt almost like normalcy. Will woke before dawn each morning, his body remembering routines it had forgotten during the long months of grief. He'd start coffee while Marin got Eli moving, the three of them gathering around the kitchen table as pink light crept through windows that stayed clean now. They'd planned the day's work over cornmeal, and whatever eggs the hens had started laying again, Marin had coaxed them back to productivity with patience and scattered grain. The homestead was transforming, not quickly, but steadily. The barn roof no longer leaked. The garden had been cleared and replanted with late-season vegetables that might, if they were lucky, produce before frost. The fences stood straight and true around the property line, marking boundaries that had grown fuzzy with neglect. Will found himself thinking in terms of seasons again. What needed doing before winter? What seeds to order for spring? What repairs would hold another year, and what needed addressing now? He was thinking like a man with a future. It was terrifying and exhilarating in equal measure. One morning in mid-August, Will was replacing rotted boards on the porch when he heard hoofbeats approaching. He straightened, hammer in hand, and watched a rider crest the rise that led to his property. The man was dressed too fine for ranch work, pressed trousers, a coat despite the heat, boots polished to a shine. He sat his horse like someone unused to riding, stiff and awkward in the saddle. As he drew closer, Will noticed the leather satchel slung across his chest and the calculating way his eyes swept the property. Not a neighbor, not a drifter, someone with business. Will set down his hammer and walked to meet him, aware of Marin watching from the garden and Eli freezing in place by the barn. "Help you?" Will called. The man reined in his horse, pulled a handkerchief from his pocket and dabbed at his sweating face. "I'm looking for a Mr. William Holt." "You found him. Excellent." The man dismounted with the graceless thump of someone who didn't do it often. "My name is Chester Wardell. I'm an attorney from Plum Creek. I represent the estate of the late Mrs. Sarah Brennan." Will's stomach dropped. He didn't need to ask who Sarah Brennan was. He could see it in the way Wardell's eyes tracked to where Marin stood frozen in the garden, dirt-stained and sun-dark, looking every inch the orphan she was. "What do you want?" Will asked, keeping his voice level. "I'm here regarding the Brennan children." Wardell opened his satchel, pulled out a sheaf of papers. "There's been some confusion about their whereabouts. The town records show they left the orphanage 3 weeks ago, but no one seemed to know where they'd gone, until someone mentioned seeing 2 children matching their description out this way." "They're here," Will said flatly. "I can see that." Wardell's tone was pleasant, but his eyes were cold. "The thing is, Mr. Holt, these children have family, a legal guardian, in fact. Mrs. Brennan's brother-in-law, Mr. Thomas Brennan, who resides in Kansas City. He's recently become aware of his niece and nephew's situation and wishes to assume custody." Will felt something cold settle in his chest. "That's so." "Indeed," Wardell tapped the papers. "I have the proper documentation. Mr. Brennan is their legal next of kin. He's prepared to provide for them, see to their education and upbringing in a proper household." "He know them?" "I beg your pardon?" "This Thomas Brennan? He ever met these children? Ever send a letter to their mother while she was dying? Ever contribute a single goddamn dollar to their care?" Wardell's pleasant expression flickered. "The particulars of Mr. Brennan's prior relationship with his late sister-in-law are not—" "That's a no, then." Will crossed his arms, very aware of his shoulder still healing, of the fact that he was one man against the law and whatever money this Thomas Brennan had behind him. "So where was this concerned uncle when those kids walked 13 miles in the August heat looking for shelter? Where was he when the orphanage turned them out?" Mr. Brennan was unaware of the situation until very recently. As soon as he learned of it, he took immediate action to— "Bullshit!" Wardell's mouth thinned. "Mr. Holt, I understand you may have developed some attachment to these children, but the law is quite clear. Blood relatives have priority in matters of custody. Mr. Brennan has every legal right to these children. They're not property." "Nevertheless," Wardell held out the papers, "I'm authorized to take custody of them today and transport them to Kansas City, where Mr. Brennan will receive them. You can make this easy or difficult, but the outcome will be the same." Will didn't take the papers. He looked past Wardell to where Marin had moved closer, her face pale, but set. Eli had come out of the barn, standing in the yard with his arms wrapped around himself. "What's Thomas Brennan do for a living?" Will asked. Wardell blinked at the question. "He owns several manufacturing concerns. Quite successful, actually. The children will want for nothing." "That what he told you? That they'd want for nothing?" Will's voice was quiet now, dangerous. "Let me tell you what I think. I think Thomas Brennan heard about 2 orphans and saw an opportunity. Free labor for his factories or his household. 2 kids who'd be grateful for a roof and wouldn't complain about conditions. Am I close?" "That's a slanderous accusation with no—" "Then let's ask them." Will turned toward the children. "Marin, come here." She came, walking slowly across the yard with Eli right behind her. When she reached them, Will saw the fear in her eyes, but also the steel. This girl had already survived more than most adults. She wasn't going to fold easy. "This man says you have an uncle in Kansas City who wants you," Will said gently. "Thomas Brennan. You know him?" Marin's jaw tightened. "Mama mentioned him once, said he's the reason she and Papa left Missouri." "What reason was that?" "Papa worked in his factory. When Papa tried to organize the workers for better wages, Uncle Thomas had him blacklisted. Couldn't get work anywhere in the city. That's why they came to Nebraska, to start fresh." Her gray eyes fixed on Wardell. "Mama said Thomas Brennan was a hard man who cared more about his profits than people." Wardell's expression soured. "A child's understanding of complex business matters is hardly—" "She's 10 years old and she's survived things you can't imagine," Will interrupted. "I'd say her understanding is just fine." He looked back at Marin. "You want to go with this man? Live with your uncle in Kansas City?" "No, sir." Her voice didn't waver. "We want to stay here. With you." Wardell made an exasperated sound. "What the child wants is immaterial. The law— I know what the law says." Will's voice cut across him like a blade. "But here's what I say. Those children walked onto my property of their own free will. They've worked hard, earned their keep, and made this place their home. I've provided for them, cared for them, given them everything they needed. That makes them mine as much as any piece of paper makes them Thomas Brennan's." "That's not how custody law works, Mr. Holt." Then maybe the law needs to learn how to ask children what they want before it ships them off to men who don't give a damn about them. Wardle's face flushed. I'll have you know, Mr. Brennan is a respected businessman with considerable influence. If you obstruct this legal process, he has the resources to make things very difficult for you. Let him try. They stood in the August heat, two men locked in a contest that had nothing to do with justice and everything to do with power. Will knew he was outmatched, knew that money and lawyers could take these children whether they wanted to go or not, but he also knew that some things were worth fighting for, even when you knew you'd lose. Finally, Wardell folded the papers back into his satchel. Very well. I can see you're not going to be reasonable about this. But understand, Mr. Holt, this isn't over. I'll be filing the appropriate motions with the territorial court. Mr. Brennan will petition for custody, and unless you can demonstrate legal grounds for keeping these children, a judge will order them remanded to their rightful guardian. How long? The court convenes in 3 weeks. Until then, I suppose they can remain here. Wardell's smile was cold. Enjoy your temporary family, Mr. Holt. It won't last. He mounted his horse with the same graceless effort and rode away without looking back, dust rising in his wake. Will stood watching until he disappeared over the rise. Then he felt small hands grip his arm. Marin, holding on tight, her whole body trembling. It's all right, Will said, though he wasn't sure it was. He's going to take us. Her voice was small now, the steel cracking. He's going to take us, and there's nothing we can do. Hey! Will crouched down so he was eye level with her. Look at me. She did, tears streaming down her face. I'm not giving up without a fight, Will said. You hear me? I don't know what that fight looks like yet, but we'll figure it out, together. You promise? Will thought about all the promises Catherine had made about their future, about the baby they'd raise and the life they'd build. He thought about how death had made a liar of every one of those promises, how nothing was certain and nothing was guaranteed. But he looked at this fierce, terrified child and her silent brother, and he made a promise anyway. I promise. That night, after the children had gone to bed, Will sat at the kitchen table with the last of the whiskey, not drinking it, just looking at it, thinking about how easy it would be to go back, to let the bottle take him, let the grief win, let someone else decide what happened to Marin and Eli. But he'd made a promise, and he'd be damned if he broke it. He poured the whiskey down the sink and went to bed sober. The next morning, Will rode into Plum Creek. The town was small, dusty, and unremarkable. A main street lined with false front buildings, a church with a crooked steeple, a scattering of houses spreading out like spokes from the commercial center. Will tied his horse outside the land office and pushed through the door into blessed shade. The clerk was a thin man with spectacles and ink-stained fingers. He looked up from his ledger with the expression of someone interrupted from important work. Help you? Need to see the county records, Will said. Custody laws, legal guardianship, adoption procedures. The clerk's eyebrows rose. That's fairly specialized. Might I ask what this is regarding? 2 orphans. Man from Kansas City claiming custody through a lawyer. I want to know what grounds I'd need to fight it. The clerk studied him for a long moment, then nodded slowly. The Brennan children. Heard about that situation? Word travels fast in a small town. Then you know I'm not letting them go without a fight. Admirable sentiment, legally complicated. The clerk stood, moved to a shelf lined with bound volumes. Territorial law is pretty clear about blood relations having priority, but there are exceptions. What kind of exceptions? If you could prove the relative is unfit, criminal record, history of abuse, inability to provide adequate care, or if you could establish yourself as a legal guardian through formal adoption proceedings. The clerk pulled down several volumes, set them on the counter. The challenge is time. Adoption takes months, sometimes years, and proving unfitness without concrete evidence is nearly impossible. Will's jaw tightened. So what you're telling me is I'm screwed. What I'm telling you is the law favors blood over circumstance, but the law also allows for testimony, for character witnesses, for arguments about the best interests of the child. The clerk opened one of the volumes, pointed to a dense paragraph of legal text. See here? A judge has discretion in custody matters if there's compelling evidence that removal would cause significant harm to the children's well-being. How do I prove that? You'd need to demonstrate that they've established a stable home with you, that they're thriving in your care, and that removing them would be detrimental. Letters from neighbors, testimony from the local minister, evidence of their material and emotional welfare. The clerk looked at Will over his spectacles. Do you have any of that? Will thought about the clean house, the mended fences, the way Eli had started smiling again. I've got 3 weeks to get it. Then I'd suggest you start now. Will spent the rest of the day talking to anyone who'd listen. The general store owner who'd sold him supplies, the blacksmith who'd reshod Sadie, the widow, 2 properties over, who'd brought over preserves when she heard there were children at the Holt place again. Some were sympathetic. Some were skeptical. A few were outright hostile. A man raising 2 children that weren't his looked suspicious to certain minds, and Will could see the calculations happening behind their eyes. But enough people were willing to help. Willing to write letters, to testify if needed, to stand up and say that Will Holt had done right by those kids when no one else would. It wasn't much, but it was something. When Will returned home that evening, he found Marin teaching Eli his letters at the kitchen table, using a piece of charcoal and a flat board. The sight stopped him in the doorway, something so ordinary and yet so precious, this small act of education happening in a house that had been empty of such things for too long. How'd it go? Marin asked without looking up. It went, Will said. He pulled out a chair, sat down heavily. I talked to a lot of people, got some promises of support. It might be enough, might not. Marin set down the charcoal. What happens if it's not enough? Will met her eyes, those gray eyes that had seen too much too soon. He could lie. Could tell her it would all work out, that everything would be fine. But she deserved better than false comfort. Then we fight anyway, he said. And if we lose, we make it as hard as possible for them to take you. We make sure every person in this county knows what Thomas Brennan is doing and why it's wrong. We make noise. And then what? Then I come get you. Marin's eyes widened. You do that? I made you a promise. Will's voice was rough. I keep my promises. For a long moment, they just looked at each other. This man who'd given up on everything, and this girl who'd never had the luxury of giving up, finding something unexpected in each other. Hope. The 3 weeks passed like water through fingers, too fast and too slow at once. Will worked harder than he'd worked in years, pushing himself and the children to get the homestead in the best shape possible. He wanted the judge to see a functioning ranch, a stable home, evidence that these kids were better off here than in some Kansas City factory town. Marin threw herself into the work with fierce determination. She sewed new curtains from feed sacks, organized the kitchen until everything had its place, tended the garden with religious devotion. She was trying to build a case with her hands, to create something so solid and real that no judge could ignore it. Eli continued his quiet transformation. He'd started speaking again, just a word here and there, but it was progress. He'd whisper to Sadie when he thought no one was listening, tell her about his day in halting sentences that grew more confident each time. Will never acknowledged it, never drew attention to it, just let the boy find his voice in his own time. The letters came in slowly. The widow Peterson wrote about seeing the children at church, clean and well-behaved. The blacksmith testified to Will's character and work ethic. Even the general store owner, a crusty old man named Garrett, who'd known Will since before Catherine died, wrote a surprisingly eloquent letter about second chances and the redemptive power of caring for others. It still might not be enough. 2 days before the court date, Will found Marin sitting on the porch steps long after she should have been asleep. The moon was bright overhead, washing everything in silver. Can't sleep? He asked, settling beside her. She shook her head. Keep thinking about Kansas City, about Uncle Thomas. You scared? Wouldn't you be? Yeah, I would be. They sat in silence for a while, listening to the night sounds, crickets chirping, wind rustling the grass, somewhere far off a coyote calling. Will? Marin's voice was small. What if the judge says we have to go? Then we do everything we can to change his mind. And if we can't? Will looked at this child who'd become so important to him in such a short time, this fierce little soul who'd walked into his life and given him a reason to live again. Then I'll come for you, he said quietly. I don't know how, don't know when, but I'll find a way. That's a promise. Marin leaned against his shoulder, just for a moment, letting herself be small and scared. Then she straightened, wiped her eyes, and went back inside to get what sleep she could. Will stayed on the porch until dawn, watching the stars wheel overhead and praying to a God he wasn't sure was listening that he'd be strong enough for what was coming. The courthouse in Plum Creek was a simple brick building that served multiple functions: court of law, town hall, an occasional dance venue when the circuit judge wasn't in residence. Today it was packed with people, word having spread about the custody case and drawn every busybody and genuinely concerned citizen within riding distance. Will sat at one of the two tables in front of the judge's bench, Marin and Eli beside him. Across the aisle sat Chester Wardell and a man Will assumed was Thomas Brennan, tall, well-fed, with the kind of face that smiled easily but never with the eyes. The judge was a gray-haired man named Carmichael, who'd been riding circuit in this territory for 20 years. He had a reputation for fairness, which was about all Will could hope for. "All rise," the bailiff called, and everyone stood as Judge Carmichael entered and took his seat. "Be seated," Carmichael said, settling his spectacles on his nose and opening the file in front of him. "We're here regarding custody of minors Marin Elizabeth Brennan and Eli James Brennan. Mr. Wardell, you're representing the petitioner?" "I am, Your Honor. Mr. Thomas Brennan, the children's paternal uncle, is seeking custody as their legal next of kin." "And Mr. Holt, you're appearing for yourself?" Will stood. "Yes, Your Honor. I'm opposing the petition." "On what grounds?" "On the grounds that these children are thriving in my care and that removing them would cause significant harm to their well-being." Carmichael nodded. "Very well. Mr. Wardell, present your case." What followed was an hour of legal maneuvering that made Will's head spin. Wardell presented Thomas Brennan as a successful businessman with ample resources to provide for the children. He submitted documentation of Brennan's financial status, letters from Kansas City clergy and civic leaders attesting to his character, and a prepared statement about his deep desire to honor his late brother's memory by caring for his children. It was all very polished, very convincing, very calculated. When it was Will's turn, he stood and spoke from the heart. "Your Honor, I'm not a rich man. I don't have fancy letters or important connections. What I have is a working ranch and a willingness to care for two children who needed help when no one else would give it." He gestured to the stack of letters his neighbors had written. "These folks will tell you that Marin and Eli have a good home with me, that they're fed, clothed, educated, and safe, that they're healing from the trauma of losing their mother." "Mr. Holt," the judge interrupted gently, "I don't doubt your sincerity or your care for these children, but the law is quite clear about the priority given to blood relatives in custody matters." "Then the law needs to account for what the children want," Will said. "Marin is old enough to know her own mind. Shouldn't she have a say?" Carmichael considered this, then nodded. "I'll allow it. Miss Brennan, approach the bench." Marin stood on shaking legs and walked forward. She looked impossibly small in front of the judge's high desk, but her back was straight and her voice was steady when she spoke. "Your Honor, I don't want to go to Kansas City. Neither does Eli." "I understand that," Carmichael said kindly, "but your uncle is prepared to offer you opportunities Mr. Holt cannot. Education, social advantages, a proper household." "I don't care about social advantages. I care about being somewhere I'm wanted for more than free labor." Marin's hands clenched at her sides. "Mama told me about Uncle Thomas. She said he valued money over people, that he'd let workers suffer rather than pay fair wages. I don't want to live with someone like that." "Those are serious accusations," Wardell interjected, "based on hearsay from a woman who was my mother," Marin said fiercely, turning to face him. "Who knew him better than you do? Who had good reason to leave Missouri and never look back?" Thomas Brennan stood then, his pleasant expression finally slipping. "Your Honor, I will not sit here and let my character be maligned by a child who doesn't understand." "Sit down, Mr. Brennan," Carmichael said sharply. Then to Marin, "Is there anything else you'd like to say?" "Yes, sir." Marin's voice shook but didn't break. "Mr. Holt didn't have to take us in. He was hurting bad when we showed up. Anyone could see that. But he helped us anyway. Fed us, sheltered us, gave us work that made us feel useful instead of pitied. He's teaching Eli to read. He's teaching me about ranching. He's treating us like we matter." Her eyes filled with tears. "Please don't make us leave, please." The courtroom was silent. Judge Carmichael looked at Marin for a long moment, then at Will, then at Thomas Brennan, whose face had gone stony. "I'll hear testimony from the witnesses," he said finally. "Then I'll make my ruling." One by one, Will's neighbors took the stand. The widow Peterson testified about seeing the children at church, clean and well-behaved and clearly cared for. The blacksmith spoke about Will's character. Old man Garrett from the general store gave a surprisingly passionate speech about redemption and the kind of man who'd take in orphans when his own life was falling apart. It was moving testimony. But Wardell countered every point with cold legal logic, blood relation, legal precedent, the resources available to Thomas Brennan versus those available to Will. The law was on his side. Finally, Judge Carmichael called for closing statements. Wardell stood and delivered a polished argument about the sanctity of family ties and the importance of children being raised by their blood relatives in proper circumstances. Then it was Will's turn. He stood slowly, looked at the judge, and decided to hell with polish. "Your Honor, I lost my wife and unborn child 18 months ago. When they died, I wanted to die too. I was drinking myself to death on a failing ranch when these kids showed up and gave me a reason to keep going. They saved my life as much as I saved theirs." He paused, gathering his thoughts. Thomas Brennan doesn't want these children because he loves them. He wants them because they're useful to him somehow. Maybe it's labor, maybe it's something else, but it sure as hell isn't love. I know that because love doesn't wait 3 weeks to show up. Love doesn't send a lawyer instead of coming yourself. Love doesn't try to take children away from the only stability they've known since their mama died. Will's voice grew stronger. "These kids chose me, Your Honor. They walked 13 miles in August heat to find my place because they thought it might be safe. And I'm standing here asking you to let them stay in the home they chose with the man who will do everything in his power to give them the life they deserve. Not the fanciest life, not the richest life, but a good life, an honest life, a life where they matter." He sat down. The courtroom was silent again. Judge Carmichael removed his spectacles, cleaned them slowly, put them back on. Then he looked at Thomas Brennan. "Mr. Brennan, in all these proceedings, I notice you haven't spoken directly to the children, haven't asked about their welfare or their wishes. Why is that?" Brennan shifted uncomfortably. "I didn't think it was appropriate to—" "You didn't think it was appropriate to speak to your own niece and nephew?" Carmichael's tone was sharp. "The children you claim to care so deeply about?" "Your Honor, Let me ask you directly, sir. Why do you want custody of these children?" The question hung in the air. Brennan's mouth worked, searching for the right answer. "Their family," he said finally. "They belong with family. And yet you had no contact with them while their mother was alive, made no effort to help her when she was struggling, didn't attend her funeral or check on her children's welfare until a lawyer informed you they might be available." Carmichael's eyes were hard. "That doesn't sound like family to me, Mr. Brennan. That sounds like opportunity." "Your Honor, I resent the implication." "Resent it all you like." Carmichael picked up his gavel. "I've heard enough. Here's my ruling." The courtroom held its breath. While the law does give preference to blood relatives in custody matters, it also requires me to consider the best interests of the children involved. Based on the testimony I've heard today, I find that Marin and Eli Brennan are thriving in the care of William Holt. They have expressed a clear preference to remain in his custody, and I find Mr. Brennan's petition to be motivated more by self-interest than genuine concern for these children's welfare. Wardell shot to his feet. "Your Honor, you can't—" "I can and I will," Carmichael said firmly. "Petition denied. Custody remains with Mr. Holt, contingent on him filing for formal legal guardianship within 60 days. If he fails to do so, the matter will be revisited." He looked at Will. "Do you understand the responsibility you're taking on, Mr. Holt?" Will stood, his heart hammering. "Yes, Your Honor, I do." "Then see that you honor it." The gavel came down. "We're adjourned." The courtroom erupted. Thomas Brennan was on his feet, face purple with rage. shouting something about appeals and influence. Wardell was trying to calm him. The neighbors who'd testified were clapping Will on the back, congratulating him. But Will only had eyes for Marin and Eli. Marin was crying, her whole body shaking with relief. Eli had grabbed Will's hand and wouldn't let go, his small fingers gripping tight enough to hurt. "We can stay?" Marin whispered. "Really stay?" "Really stay," Will confirmed, his own voice rough with emotion. "You're mine now, both of you, legal and binding." She threw her arms around him then, and Eli did too, and the three of them stood in the middle of the chaotic courtroom holding on to each other like they might disappear if they let go. They rode home as the sun was setting, three figures on horseback moving across the prairie under a sky painted gold and crimson. Nobody spoke. There was too much to say and no words big enough to hold it all. When they reached the homestead, Eli went straight to the barn to check on Sadie, and Marin followed Will into the house. "I'll start supper," she said, moving toward the kitchen. "Marin," Will caught her arm gently. "Wait." She turned, those gray eyes watching him. "You know this doesn't make everything perfect, right?" Will said carefully. "I'm still figuring this out. Still learning how to be what you need. I'm going to make mistakes. I know. And winters here are hard. Money's going to be tight. There'll be times when—" "Mr. Holt," Marin's voice was steady. "We know. We're not expecting perfect. We're just expecting you to try. That's all we've ever wanted, someone who'd try." Will looked at this fierce, practical child who'd survived more than most adults and felt something shift in his chest. The grief he'd been carrying for 18 months was still there, would always be there probably. But it had made room for something else now, something that felt like family. "All right then," he said. "Let's try together." Marin smiled, a real smile, the first one he'd seen from her that didn't have fear hiding behind it. "Together," she agreed. That night, Will lay in his bedroll listening to the sounds of the house settling, the whisper of wind through the eaves, the soft breathing of children sleeping in the next room. He thought about Catherine, about the family they'd planned to build. This wasn't that family, could never be that family, but it was a family nonetheless, and that Will decided was more than enough. The legal guardianship papers arrived 6 weeks later, official and stamped with the territorial seal, making permanent what had already felt inevitable. Will kept them in the trunk with Catherine's things, not hiding them, but storing them somewhere that mattered, where promises were kept even after death changed everything. September brought the first whisper of autumn to the plains. The brutal heat eased into something bearable, and the evening air carried a crispness that hadn't been there before. The garden produced its modest harvest: squash, beans, a few precious potatoes that Marion stored in the root cellar with the care of someone who'd known hunger. The chickens laid steady, the barn stood secure, and the fence line held strong against the wind that was already starting to bite. They fell into patterns that felt less like survival and more like living. Eli's vocabulary grew daily, whole sentences emerging where there'd been only silence. He still preferred Sadie's company to most humans, but he'd started joining the supper conversation, offering observations about the horses or asking questions about how things worked. His voice was soft, tentative, but it was there. Marin had taken to the ranch work with an intensity that sometimes worried Will. She pushed herself hard trying to prove something to him, to herself, to the world that had tried to take her away. She could mend tack nearly as well as he could, knew which hens were laying and which were freeloading, could read the sky for weather changes with an accuracy that came from paying attention when your life depended on it. One evening in late September, Will found her in the barn long after the work was done, oiling a saddle that didn't need oiling. "Getting dark," he said from the doorway. "Supper's ready. I'll be in soon." She didn't look up, just kept working the oil into leather that was already supple. Will leaned against the doorframe, watching her. "You know you don't have to work yourself to exhaustion to earn your place here, right?" Her hands stilled. "I know." "Do you?" Marin set down the rag, finally meeting his eyes. "What if you change your mind?" "About what?" "About us. About this." She gestured vaguely at the barn, the house beyond it, the life they were building. "What if it gets too hard or too expensive, or you just decide it's not worth it anymore?" "That's not going to happen." "You don't know that." People change their minds all the time. People leave. Will crossed to where she sat, crouched down so they were eye level. Your mama didn't leave you by choice, Marin. She got sick. That's different from choosing to go. I know that. Her voice was small. But the result's the same, isn't it? We were alone either way. You're not alone now. But we could be. If you got sick, or if something happened, or if you just woke up one day and realized taking care of 2 kids was harder than you thought. Hey! Will put a hand on her shoulder. Look at me. She did, those gray eyes bright with unshed tears. I'm not going anywhere, Will said firmly. And yeah, things might get hard. Probably will get hard. Winter's coming, money's tight, and I'm making this up as I go most days. But that doesn't mean I'm going to quit on you. You understand? How can you promise that? Because I already did. The day I stood in that courtroom and told the judge you were mine. That wasn't just words, Marin. That was a vow. The same kind of vow I made to your Aunt Catherine when I married her. He paused, making sure she heard him. I keep my vows. A tear slipped down her cheek. What if I mess up? What if I do something wrong? And then we'll figure it out, together. That's what families do. Will squeezed her shoulder gently. You don't have to be perfect to deserve a home. You just have to be you. Marin wiped her eyes roughly, trying to regain her composure. Eli's the easy one. I'm the one who's all sharp edges and worry. Sharp edges kept you alive. Worry kept your brother safe. I'm not asking you to change who you are. I'm just asking you to trust that you're allowed to stop fighting quite so hard. She nodded slowly, not quite believing him, but wanting to. They walked back to the house together as twilight deepened into night, and over supper Will told them about the fall work that needed doing. Wood to cut and stack before the snow came, the last repairs to weatherproof the barn, supplies to lay in for winter. He talked about it like they'd all be here to see it through, like there was no question of permanence. Slowly, Marin began to relax. October arrived with frost painting the grass silver in the mornings, and geese flying south in ragged V formations that spoke of winter's approach. Will took the children to town for supplies, their first trip back to Plum Creek since the court case. He expected stares, maybe some hostility from folks who'd sided with Thomas Brennan or just disapproved of his unconventional family. What he got was something else entirely. Mrs. Peterson flagged them down outside the general store, pressing a jar of preserves into Marin's hands and asking after Eli's reading progress. The blacksmith gave Eli a piece of hard candy and told Will his credit was good whenever he needed work done. Even old man Garrett, who'd never been friendly to anyone, nodded at them with something approaching respect. Well, Will said as they loaded supplies into the wagon. That was unexpected. People like an underdog, Marin said pragmatically. We were the underdog. Now we're the story everyone tells about standing up to bullies. You're getting cynical in your old age. I'm 10. Like I said, old. She smiled, and it reached her eyes this time. They were halfway home when they spotted smoke on the horizon. Too much smoke, too dark, coming from the direction of the widow Peterson's property. Will snapped the reins, pushing the horses faster, his stomach tight with dread. The Peterson place was fully engulfed by the time they arrived. The small house that had stood there was collapsing in on itself, flames shooting through the roof, while the widow stood in the yard with her arms wrapped around herself, watching everything she owned turn to ash. Will jumped down from the wagon before it fully stopped. Anyone inside? Mrs. Peterson shook her head, her face blank with shock. Just me. I got out. But everything else… Stay back, Will ordered, though the heat made it impossible to get close anyway. He looked around, assessing. The barn was untouched, the animals safe in the pasture, the well was intact, but the house was gone, and with it everything that made it a home. What happened? Marin asked quietly, appearing at Will's elbow. Stovepipe, probably, Mrs. Peterson said numbly. I knew it needed replacing, kept meaning to get it fixed, but the money was tight, and I thought maybe another season… She trailed off, watching sparks swirl into the darkening sky. Will's mind was already working through the logistics. Winter was 6 weeks away, maybe less. A woman alone couldn't survive on the plains without shelter. The barn would keep her alive but barely, and not with any dignity. You'll stay with us, he heard himself say. Mrs. Peterson turned to stare at him. What? You'll stay with us until we can figure something else out or get your place rebuilt. He said it firmly, like it was already decided, because it was. We've got the room. Mr. Holt, I couldn't possibly. You brought us preserves when these kids first showed up, testified in court when we needed it, wrote letters vouching for my character when most folks thought I was crazy. Will met her eyes. I'm returning the favor. No arguments. Mrs. Peterson's composure finally cracked. She pressed a hand to her mouth, tears streaming down her soot-smudged face. Thank you, she whispered. They loaded what little had been saved, a few pieces of furniture pulled from the barn, some clothes, a tin box containing papers and photographs, and headed back to the Holt place as full dark settled over the prairie. Mrs. Peterson sat in the wagon bed, staring at nothing, while Marin held Eli close, and Will wondered what the hell he was doing taking in yet another person when he could barely manage the three of them. But he'd made the offer, and he'd see it through. They gave Mrs. Peterson Catherine's old room, the one Will still hadn't been able to enter most days, where his wife's dresses still hung in the wardrobe and her hairbrush still sat on the dresser. He carried in the salvaged furniture while Marin made up the bed with clean linens, and neither of them spoke about what it meant that someone else would sleep where Catherine never would again. Mrs. Peterson stood in the doorway looking at the room with red-rimmed eyes. This was your wife's room. Was, Will said. Isn't anymore. You need it more than a ghost does. I won't be a burden. I can work, cook, clean, help with the children. We'll figure it out. Will was tired suddenly, bone-deep tired from the day and the decision and the weight of being responsible for more lives than he'd ever planned to shepherd. Right now you need rest. We all do. That night, the house felt different. More crowded, more complicated. Will lay awake listening to unfamiliar sounds. Mrs. Peterson crying quietly in Catherine's old room, Marin and Eli whispering to each other in theirs, the wind picking up outside with the promise of an early storm. He'd gone from wanting to die alone to being responsible for 3 people in the space of 4 months. Life, he decided, had a strange sense of humor. The next morning brought clarity in the form of practical problems. Mrs. Peterson was 63 years old, strong for her age, but not strong enough for heavy ranch work. She could cook, which was a blessing since Marin's skills ran more toward functional than flavorful. She could mend, preserve food, manage a household. She couldn't fix fences or shoe horses or haul water from the well without aggravating the arthritis in her hands. They divided the labor according to ability. Mrs. Peterson took over the kitchen and the house, transforming both with an efficiency that spoke of decades of practice. Marin continued with the outside work, seeming almost relieved to have another woman in the house to handle things she'd been doing out of necessity rather than preference. Eli worked with the animals, his quiet nature suited to creatures that didn't require conversation, and Will held it all together through sheer stubbornness and prayer. The arrangement should have been temporary, should have been a few weeks until the widow's family could be contacted or other arrangements made. But Mrs. Peterson had no family. Her husband dead 15 years, her only son killed in the war, no siblings or cousins close enough to matter. And the more Will watched her settle into their household, the more he realized she needed this place as much as they needed her. You're building yourself a ranch full of strays, Mrs. Peterson observed one evening as they sat on the porch watching the sunset. The children were in the barn doing evening chores, their voices carrying on the wind. Seems that way, Will agreed. You ever think about what folks must say? Every day. Try not to care. She smiled. Good policy. A pause, then, I won't overstay my welcome. Come spring, I can move to town, find a room somewhere. Will you stop? Will interrupted. You're staying. End of discussion. You can't just collect every lost soul in the territory, William. Watch me. Mrs. Peterson laughed, the sound surprised and genuine. Your Catherine would have liked this, you know. The noise, the purpose. She always said this house needed filling. Will felt the familiar ache in his chest, but pushed through it. She did say that. And now it's filled, just not how either of you planned. No, not how we planned. They sat in companionable silence as the sky turned from orange to purple to deep blue, and somewhere in the barn, Eli laughed at something Maureen said, the sound carrying clear and bright in the evening air. Winter announced itself in early November with a storm that came out of the north like vengeance. The temperature dropped 20 degrees overnight, and by morning, the world was white and howling. Will had seen blizzards before, had survived the winter of '79 when the snow had piled so deep against the barn he'd had to tunnel through to reach the animals. But this one had teeth. They hunkered down, all four of them, while the wind screamed around the house and snow piled against the walls. Mrs. Peterson kept the stove going, rationing wood but keeping the house warm enough to survive. Marin and Eli stayed close, reading books by lamplight or playing quiet games while the storm raged outside. Will checked on the animals every few hours, fighting his way through waist-deep drifts to make sure the barn held and the livestock hadn't frozen. Sadie and the other horses were fine, huddled together for warmth. The chickens had stopped laying but were alive. The milk cow looked miserable but endured. On the second day of the storm, the wind finally died, leaving behind an eerie quiet and a landscape transformed. The snow had sculpted itself into fantastic shapes, drifts 20 feet high in some places, bare ground in others where the wind had scoured it clean. The sky was pale and brittle, the air so cold it hurt to breathe. "We'll need to dig out," Will said, surveying the damage. "Path to the barn, path to the well, and we need to check the fence line to make sure nothing broke under the weight." "I'll help," Marin said immediately. "Me too," Eli added, his voice stronger than it had been months ago. So they worked, the three of them, shoveling snow and checking structures and making sure their small piece of the world was secure. Mrs. Peterson kept hot coffee and food ready, taking care of them the way she'd probably taken care of her own family once upon a time. By evening, they were exhausted but satisfied. The homestead had weathered its first real test with this particular configuration of people, and they'd come through intact. "That's one storm down," Will said as they gathered around the kitchen table for supper. "Probably a dozen more before spring." "We'll manage," Mrs. Peterson said calmly, ladling out stew. "We managed this one." "We did," Marin agreed. She looked around the table, at Will, at Mrs. Peterson, at her brother, and something in her expression softened. "We make a pretty good team." "That we do," Will said. Eli smiled into his stew, and outside the wind picked up again, but inside the house was warm and full and felt like something worth fighting for. The weeks that followed settled into a rhythm shaped by necessity and cold. Will cut wood until his hands bled, stacking it against the north wall of the house where it would stay dry. Marin learned to read the sky for incoming weather, developing an instinct for when to bring the animals in close and when they could range farther. Eli proved surprisingly adept at small repairs, his careful nature suited to detailed work that required patience. Mrs. Peterson became the heart of the household, the one who knew where everything was and when everyone needed feeding, and who mediated the small conflicts that arose when four people lived in close quarters through a hard winter. She never overstepped, never tried to replace Catherine's memory, but she made space for herself in ways that felt natural rather than intrusive. December brought Christmas, though none of them had much to celebrate with. Money was tight, luxuries non-existent, but Mrs. Peterson made sugar cookies from their precious supply of flour and molasses, and Will carved small wooden animals for Eli, a horse, a cow, a dog, working on them in secret during the quiet hours before dawn. For Marin, he made something different. A small box, cedar wood smoothed until it gleamed with a lid that fit perfectly and hinges he'd traded the blacksmith for. Inside he placed a letter, written in his careful hand, that said simply, "You belong here. This is your home. No matter what comes, that won't change." On Christmas morning, Marin opened the box and read the letter with tears streaming down her face. She didn't say anything, just threw her arms around Will's neck and held on tight while Eli showed Mrs. Peterson his carved animals, and the widow smiled like she'd been given something precious. It wasn't the Christmas Will had imagined having. It was better. January was brutal. The cold settled in and refused to leave, temperatures dropping so low that water froze solid in the bucket overnight and frost formed on the inside of the windows. They lived in the kitchen mostly, keeping the fire going and only venturing to other rooms when necessary. On the worst nights, they dragged blankets into the kitchen and slept there together, all four of them, because it was the only way to stay warm enough to survive until morning. Will would wake sometimes and see them sleeping. Marin curled against Mrs. Peterson's side, Eli sprawled in the boneless way of children, the widow's weathered hand resting protective on the girl's shoulder. His family. Strange and cobbled together, and nothing like what he'd planned, but his family nonetheless. February brought a brief thaw, then another storm that was somehow worse than the first. Will lost 2 chickens to the cold despite his best efforts, and came back from the barn one morning to find Mrs. Peterson white-faced and trembling. "What happened?" he asked, alarm spiking through him. "Pain," she managed. "In my chest. It's passing now, but for a moment." Will helped her to a chair, his mind racing, heart trouble. Had to be. And they were miles from town, snowed in, with no way to get her to a doctor, even if they could afford one. "Marin," he said quietly, "get the whiskey from the shelf, and some water." Marin moved fast, her face pale. She understood sickness, understood how quickly things could go wrong. Mrs. Peterson waved them off weakly. "I'm fine. Just a spell. Happens sometimes at my age." "How often is sometimes?" Will demanded. She didn't answer, which was answer enough. "You're staying in bed until this passes," he said firmly. "No arguments. Marin and I can handle the house." The children need you alive," Will interrupted. "So you're going to rest and let us take care of things for a change." Mrs. Peterson looked like she wanted to argue, but didn't have the strength. They helped her to her room, settled her under every blanket they could spare, and left her to sleep. Will found Marin in the kitchen afterward, staring at nothing. "She's going to be okay," he said, trying to sound certain. "You don't know that." Marin's voice was flat. "People die all the time. Mama did. Your wife did. Mrs. Peterson could too." "She could," Will admitted. "But she's tough, and she's got us looking after her. That counts for something." "Does it? Because it feels like every time we get settled, something tries to take it away again." Will pulled out a chair, sat down across from her. "You're right, life's not fair, and bad things happen to good people all the time. But we can't live in fear of what might happen. We can only do our best with what's in front of us. And if our best isn't enough, then we'll deal with it. Together." He reached across the table, took her hand. "You're not alone in this, Marin. Not anymore. Whatever comes, we face it as a family." She nodded, not quite believing, but wanting to. "What do we do now?" "Now we take care of her the way she's been taking care of us. We keep this place running. We make it through winter." He squeezed her hand. "And we trust that come spring, things will look different." Mrs. Peterson recovered slowly over the following week. The pain didn't return, but she moved more carefully, tired more easily. She never quite admitted to the seriousness of what had happened, but she stopped pretending she was invincible. Will watched her carefully, aware of how fragile their situation was. They were 4 people surviving on the edge of the world, held together by choice and circumstance, and the sheer refusal to give up. If one piece failed, the whole structure might collapse. But they held. March arrived with mud and the first hints that winter might eventually end. The snow began to melt, turning the yard into a bog and the roads into impassable rivers of ice and slush. They were trapped still, but it was a different kind of trapped, one that felt temporary rather than permanent. One evening, as they gathered around the table for supper, Mrs. Peterson cleared her throat. "I've been thinking," she said, "about what happens when spring truly comes." Will felt Marin tense beside him. "What about it?" "My place, what's left of it." She folded her hands on the table. "I could rebuild. Use what insurance money I get, start over. Be independent again." "Could do that," Will agreed carefully. "But I don't want to." The words hung in the air. "I like it here," Mrs. Peterson continued. "I like being useful, like having people to care for and people who care about me. I'm too old to start over alone. And truthfully, I don't see the point." She met Will's eyes. "If you'll have me, I'd like to stay. Permanently. Pull my weight, contribute what I can, be part of what you're building here." Will felt something warm settle in his chest. You're already part of it. Then I'm asking to make it official, however that needs to look. We'd be lucky to have you, Will said simply. All of us. Mrs. Peterson's eyes filled. Thank you. Marin reached across the table, took the older woman's hand. Your family now, same as us. Strange family we make, Mrs. Peterson said with a watery laugh. Best kind, Eli said softly. It was the most he'd said it once in weeks, and everyone turned to look at him. He blushed but didn't take it back. It's true. We all chose each other. That's better than blood. Will looked at this boy who'd been silent when he arrived, this girl who'd been all hard edges and survival, this widow who'd lost everything and found something new. He thought about Catherine, about the family they'd planned, about all the ways life had turned out differently than expected. Yeah, he said. I think you're right. April brought the final thaw and with it a sense of possibility. The prairie turned green almost overnight, wildflowers exploding across the grassland in riots of color. The animals emerged from their winter torpor, the chickens started laying again, and Sadie practically danced in the pasture like she couldn't believe she'd survived another winter. Will walked the fence line with Marin on the first truly warm day, checking for damage and making repairs where needed. She worked beside him with practiced efficiency, no longer the scared child who'd shown up 8 months ago, but something stronger, more certain. You ever regret it? She asked as they pounded in a new post. Taking us in, all of this? Will considered the question seriously. No. Do you regret walking 13 miles in the heat to find this place? No. She paused in her work, looked back at the house where Mrs. Peterson was hanging laundry and Eli was brushing Sadie in the yard. I thought we'd be moving on by now, thought this was just temporary until something better came along. And now? Now I think this is the something better. She met his eyes. I think we're home. Will smiled. Yeah, I think we are too. They finished the fence as the sun climbed higher, working in comfortable silence. And when they headed back to the house for the midday meal, Will felt something he hadn't felt in almost 2 years. Peace. Not the absence of problems. They still had plenty of those. Money was tight, the ranch demanded constant work, and who knew what challenges the next season would bring. But they had each other, this strange assembled family, and that was enough to face whatever came next. That evening, they sat on the porch together, watching the sunset paint the sky in shades of gold and crimson. Mrs. Peterson was mending in her rocking chair, the one that had been Catherine's. Eli was whittling a piece of wood Will had given him, trying to match the carved animals from Christmas. Marin was reading aloud from a book borrowed from town, her voice steady and clear. Will listened to her read, watched the sun sink toward the horizon, and thought about how far they'd all come. From grief and loss and desperate survival to something that looked remarkably like a life worth living. Mr. Holt? Eli said suddenly. Can I ask you something? Sure. Do you think, would it be okay if... He struggled with the words, his face scrunched with concentration. Could we maybe call you Pa? Not to replace our real father, but just because that's kind of what you are to us now? The world stopped. Will looked at this 7-year-old boy with his serious eyes and careful question, then at Marin, who was watching him hopefully, then at Mrs. Peterson, who smiled encouragingly. I'd be honored, he managed past the tightness in his throat. Eli's face lit up. Really? Really? Then, good night, Pa. Good night, son. The words felt strange and right all at once, like putting on a coat that had been tailored specifically for you. Will had never expected to be anyone's father, had given up on that dream the day they buried Catherine and their unborn child. But here he was anyway, with 2 children who'd chosen him and a widow who'd decided they were all worth staying for, building something new from the wreckage of their separate losses. As darkness fell and stars began appearing overhead, they filed inside one by one. His family, strange and beautiful, and completely unexpected. Will was the last to enter, pausing in the doorway to look back at the prairie stretching endlessly under the night sky. Somewhere out there, Catherine was buried. His old life was buried, the man he'd been when grief had nearly killed him. But here, in this house full of voices and warmth and the messy, complicated business of living, something new had taken root, and it was growing. Spring unfolded with the kind of relentless beauty that made a man forget how brutal the winter had been. The prairie exploded with wildflowers, Indian paintbrush and prairie clover, black-eyed Susans and wild roses that turned the grassland into something that belonged in a painting rather than the hard reality of Nebraska territory. The creek that ran along the eastern edge of Will's property swelled with snowmelt, rushing and tumbling over rocks that had been dry since last autumn. Will threw himself into the work with renewed energy. There were fields to plow, seeds to plant, fences to reinforce after winter's damage. The barn needed new shingles where ice had torn them loose. The chicken coop required expansion now that the hens were laying again, and Mrs. Peterson had announced her intention to increase their flock. Every day brought a dozen tasks that needed doing, and for the first time in years, Will welcomed them. He wasn't working to forget anymore. He was working to build. Marin had grown taller over the winter, shooting up until her dresses hit above her ankles, and Mrs. Peterson had to let down hems that couldn't be let down any further. She moved with a confidence that hadn't been there before, comfortable in her skin and her place in the world. She could handle a team of horses now, could read the land well enough to know where water would pool and where it would drain, could fix most things that broke around the ranch without needing Will's help. She was becoming someone formidable, and Will felt a pride he had no right to but claimed anyway. Eli had transformed even more dramatically. The silent, frightened child who'd arrived last summer was gone, replaced by a boy who asked endless questions and laughed easily and had opinions about everything from the best way to curry a horse to whether they should plant corn or wheat in the back 40. He followed Will everywhere, soaking up knowledge like the dry earth soaked up rain, wanting to know how things worked and why, and what would happen if you did them differently. "He's going to be a thinker," Mrs. Peterson observed one evening as they watched Eli examine a broken pocket watch Will had given him, his small face scrunched in concentration as he tried to understand the mechanism. "Better a thinker than a drinker," Will replied, then immediately regretted it, but Mrs. Peterson just smiled. "You haven't touched the bottle in months. Don't think I haven't noticed. Haven't needed it." "No," she agreed softly. "You haven't." They sat in comfortable silence, the kind that only came from people who'd survived hard things together and come out the other side still standing. In late April, Will rode to town for supplies and came back with news that set the whole household buzzing. The territorial government was offering land grants to homesteaders who could prove improvement. A full quarter section, 160 acres, for anyone willing to work it and make it productive. There were stipulations, requirements about crops planted and structures built, but the opportunity was real. "That's more than double what we have now," Marin said, studying the notice Will had brought back. "We could expand the herd, plant more crops, maybe even—" "It's a lot of work," Will cautioned. "More than the four of us can handle, probably." "So we hire help," Mrs. Peterson said practically. "Or we find another stray that needs taking in." Will laughed. "You think I'm running a charitable institution? Aren't you?" He didn't have an answer for that, but the idea took root. And over the following days, they discussed possibilities. The additional land would give them breathing room, a buffer against bad years. They could rotate crops, let some pasture rest while using others. With more acreage, they could support more livestock, which meant more income, which meant more security. It meant a future that extended beyond just surviving season to season. "I want to do it," Will announced one morning over breakfast. "File for the grant. See if we can make something bigger here." "We'll need a proper barn on the new section," Marin said immediately, already planning. "And we should dig a second well. Can't rely on the creek year-round." "Fencing," Eli added. "Lots of fencing." Mrs. Peterson smiled into her coffee. "Sounds like we have our summer planned." Will filed the paperwork the next week, and by May they were working ground that had never seen a plow. The soil was rich and dark, untouched prairie sod that fought them with every furrow. Will worked until his shoulders screamed and his hands bled through the calluses, and still the land demanded more. But slowly, impossibly, it yielded. They planted wheat on 20 acres, corn on another 10, left the rest for pasture. Marin took charge of marking fence lines, working with a surveyor's precision to ensure they claimed every inch they were entitled to. Eli surprised everyone by demonstrating a talent for working with the draft horses, gentle enough that the big animals trusted him, and strong enough to guide them where they needed to go. Mrs. Peterson managed the household and kept them all fed and functioning, her quiet competence the foundation on which everything else rested. By mid-June, they were exhausted and sunburned and more satisfied than any of them could remember being. Then Thomas Brennan came back. Will was repairing fence on the new property line when he saw the dust cloud approaching. 3 riders moving fast across the prairie. Something about the way they rode set his teeth on edge. Too purposeful, too direct. This wasn't a neighborly visit. He set down his tools and waited, aware that Marin was working 50 yards away and that Eli was back at the barn alone with Mrs. Peterson. Too spread out, too vulnerable. The riders resolved into Thomas Brennan, flanked by 2 men Will didn't recognize. Big men, hired muscle by the look of them. Brennan looked worse than he had in the courtroom. Thinner, harder, with an edge of desperation that made him dangerous. "Holt," Brennan said, reining in his horse. "Brennan." Will kept his voice neutral. "You're a long way from Kansas City." "Not so far I can't check on my niece and nephew." Brennan's eyes scanned the property, calculating and cold. "Looks like you've done well for yourself. Expanded, I see." "What do you want?" "What I've always wanted. My family." Brennan dismounted, and his companions did the same. "I've been doing some research, Holt. Turns out your legal guardianship has some interesting loopholes." Will's stomach tightened. The court decided based on incomplete information. They didn't know, for instance, that you're filing for additional land grants, that you're building what amounts to a commercial operation here. Brennan smiled, and it wasn't pleasant. Children aren't supposed to be used as labor in homesteading claims. There are laws about that. Protections. Those children aren't labor, they're family. That's not how my lawyers see it. They see 2 minors being exploited for their work capacity to help you meet improvement requirements for a valuable land grant. Brennan pulled a folded document from his coat. "I have a new petition filed with the territorial court, alleging abuse, exploitation, and violation of child labor statutes." "That's bullshit and you know it." "Is it? Because from where I'm standing, you've got a 10-year-old girl working fence lines and a 7-year-old boy handling dangerous farm equipment." Brennan's voice took on a righteous tone that made Will's fists clench. "A judge might see that differently than you do. They're learning, being raised on a ranch, same as every other farm child in this territory. We'll let the court decide that." Brennan tucked the document away. "Hearings in 2 weeks, and this time, Holt, you won't have a sympathetic judge or small-town witnesses to prop up your story. This is territorial court, real lawyers, real scrutiny." One of Brennan's companions stepped forward, hand resting on the pistol at his belt. "Mr. Brennan's made you a generous offer. Sign over custody now, save yourself the legal fees and embarrassment." Will's eyes locked on the gun. "You threatening me?" "Just pointing out the practical realities." The man's smile was ugly. "Accidents happen on ranches. Tools fail. Fences collapse. Be a shame if something happened to complicate your situation further." "Get off my land." Will's voice was quiet, deadly. "Now." Brennan remounted his horse, his companions following suit. 2 weeks, Holt, and this time you won't win. I've got resources you can't imagine, and lawyers who make territorial judges look like school children. Those kids are coming with me whether you like it or not." They rode off, leaving Will standing in the prairie grass with rage and fear churning in his gut. Marin appeared at his elbow, her face pale. "I heard everything." "How much?" "Enough." Her voice shook. "He's going to take us, isn't he? For real this time." Will wanted to lie, to tell her it would be fine, that he'd protect them no matter what. But she deserved honesty. "He's going to try," Will said, "but we're not going down without a fight." That night they gathered around the kitchen table, all 4 of them, and planned their defense like generals preparing for battle. Mrs. Peterson had contacts in town, people who might testify again. Marin suggested documenting every aspect of their daily life to prove the children weren't being exploited. Eli, voice small but determined, said he'd tell the judge himself that he wanted to stay. "The problem is the new land grant," Will said heavily. Brennan's right. It makes me look like I'm using you for labor, like you're economic assets instead of family. Then withdraw the application, Mrs. Peterson said. We need that land. Without it, we're barely scraping by. One bad harvest and we're finished. Better finished than without the children, she countered. What good is land if we lose what matters? Will looked at Marin and Eli, at these two souls who'd become his purpose for living, and knew she was right. I'll withdraw it tomorrow, he said. No. Marin's voice cut through the discussion. Don't. Marin, if you withdraw it, he wins. He gets to control what we do, how we live, what chances we take. Her gray eyes blazed. We fight him in court. We show the judge the truth, that we're a family working together, that we all benefit from this place succeeding. That's not exploitation. That's just life on a ranch. She's right, Eli said quietly. We're not being used. We're building something. There's a difference. Will felt something fierce and proud swell in his chest. You're both sure about this? They nodded in unison. Then we fight, he said. All of us. Together. The next 2 weeks were a blur of preparation and anxiety. Will documented everything, the children's schoolwork, their chores, the time they spent playing versus working, every meal, every conversation, every moment that proved they were cherished rather than exploited. Mrs. Peterson wrote letters to everyone she'd ever known, calling in favors and begging for support. Marin and Eli practiced what they'd say to the judge, their testimony carefully honest but framed to show their life as it truly was. Will also did something else. He visited every ranch within riding distance, talked to every homesteader who had children, asked them about their work routines and family dynamics. What he found was both reassuring and damning. Every farm child in the territory worked. That was simply how things were. Children hauled water, fed animals, helped with planting and harvest. It was called growing up, not exploitation. But Thomas Brennan had money and lawyers who could twist that truth into something ugly. The day before the hearing, Will found Marin in the barn, sitting on a hay bale with her arms wrapped around herself. You okay? He asked. Scared, she admitted. What if the judge believes him? What if we did everything right and it still doesn't matter? Will sat beside her. Then we deal with it. But Marin, I need you to know something. No matter what happens tomorrow, you and Eli changed my life. You saved me when I didn't think I could be saved. If the worst happens and the court rules against us, that doesn't erase what we built here. It doesn't make it less real. It does if they take us away. Even then, you'll know you're loved. You'll know you have a home to come back to whenever you can. That knowledge, that's something no judge can take from you. Marin leaned against his shoulder, this girl who'd been forced to grow up too fast but still deserved to be a child sometimes. I don't want to leave, she whispered. I don't want you to either, Will said honestly. So tomorrow we fight like hell to make sure you don't have to. The territorial courthouse in Grand Island was bigger and more formal than the Plum Creek building where they'd fought the first custody battle. Stone columns flanked the entrance, and inside the floors were polished marble that echoed with every footstep. It felt designed to intimidate, and it worked. Will sat at the defendant's table with Marin and Eli on either side of him. He'd scraped together enough money to hire a lawyer, a young man fresh from back east named Harrison, who had more enthusiasm than experience but seemed genuinely committed to their cause. Across the aisle sat Thomas Brennan with his team of 3 attorneys, each one more polished and expensive-looking than the last. The judge was a stern-faced woman named Harriet Caldwell, who had a reputation for being unmoved by sentiment and focused entirely on the letter of the law. She listened to opening arguments with an expression that revealed nothing. Brennan's lead attorney, a silver-haired man named Whitmore, laid out their case with brutal efficiency. He presented evidence of the children's work schedules, photographs of Marin operating farm equipment, testimony from a social reformer who argued that farm labor was damaging to child development. He painted Will as a calculating opportunist who'd taken in orphans specifically to exploit them for homesteading purposes. The defendant would have this court believe his motives are pure, Whitmore said, his voice dripping with skepticism. But the timing is revealing. He files for legal guardianship, then immediately applies for a substantial land grant that requires proving improvement through intensive labor. Where does that labor come from? Two children who should be in school, not working fence lines and plowing fields. It sounded damning because Whitmore made it sound damning, twisting the truth just enough to create doubt. Harrison did his best in response. He called Mrs. Peterson to testify about the children's daily lives, the balance between work and play, the education they received and the love they were shown. He called neighbors who spoke about seeing the family together, about the obvious bond between Will and the children. But it felt thin compared to Brennan's presentation, like a house of cards against a stone wall. Then Harrison called Maren to the stand. She walked to the witness box with her head high, wearing the dress Mrs. Peterson had sewn for the occasion. She looked young and small in the formal setting, but her voice was steady when she took the oath. "Miss Brennan," Harrison began gently, "can you describe a typical day on the Holt Ranch?" "I wake up around dawn," Maren said. "Help Mrs. Peterson with breakfast. Then after we eat, I do my schoolwork for about 2 hours. Mrs. Peterson teaches me reading and arithmetic, and Mr. Holt, teaches me about land management and animal husbandry." "And after your lessons?" "Depends on what needs doing. Sometimes I help with the garden, sometimes with the animals. In the afternoon, I usually have free time to read or play with Eli. Then evening chores, feeding chickens, gathering eggs, helping with supper." "How many hours would you say you work each day?" "Maybe 3 or 4, not counting meals or time I spend learning things I want to learn." Harrison nodded. "Does Mr. Holt force you to do this work?" "No, sir. He asks if I'm willing, and I say yes because I want to help. It's my home, too." Whitmore stood for cross-examination, his expression paternal and concerned in a way that made Will's skin crawl. "Miss Brennan, you're how old?" 10, almost 11. "And you've been living with Mr. Holt for approximately 11 months?" "Yes, sir." "In that time, have you ever been injured while working?" Maren hesitated. "I got a small cut once when I was learning to mend tack. Healed fine." "I see. And you say you attend school for 2 hours daily. That's significantly less than the 6 hours required by territorial education statutes, isn't it?" "We're too far from town for regular school. Mrs. Peterson teaches me at home." "Mrs. Peterson, the widow who lives with you, does she have formal teaching credentials?" "No, sir, but she's educated and she teaches me well. I can read better than most kids my age, and I'm working through advanced arithmetic." "According to whose assessment, there's no official record of your progress, is there?" Maren's jaw tightened. "No, sir." "So we're to take your word, a 10-year-old child's word, that you're receiving adequate education while spending a significant portion of each day performing manual labor?" "I'm not just performing labor. I'm learning to run a ranch, to be self-sufficient, to be useful to Mr. Holt's commercial enterprise," Whitmore interrupted smoothly. "Tell me, Miss Brennan, when Mr. Holt filed for the additional land grant, did he discuss with you how much work would be required to meet the improvement requirements?" "He talked about what we'd need to do together. Together. Meaning you and your 7-year-old brother would be expected to contribute labor to help him qualify for valuable land rights." "It's not like that, isn't it? You just testified that you work 3 to 4 hours daily. Multiply that by 7 days a week over 11 months, and we're talking about over 1,000 hours of unpaid child labor." Harrison objected, arguing that Whitmore was mischaracterizing family contribution as exploitation, but the damage was done. Will could see it on Judge Caldwell's face. Doubt creeping in, questions forming. When Eli took the stand, he was nervous but determined. He spoke carefully about his daily routine, about the time he spent with Sadie and the other horses, about how Will taught him to read tracks and predict weather and fix broken equipment. "Do you want to live with Mr. Holt?" Harrison asked. "Yes, sir. More than anything." "Why?" Eli's voice was small but fierce. "Because he chose us. When nobody else wanted us, when we had nowhere to go, he took us in and made us his family. He's teaching me things my real pa never got the chance to teach me. He's giving us a future." Whitmore's cross-examination was gentler with Eli, but no less effective. "Son, you're 7 years old. You testified that you work with horses and farm equipment. Isn't that dangerous for someone your age?" "I'm careful. Pa taught me how to be safe." "But accidents happen, don't they? Horses spook, equipment fails. Wouldn't you be safer in a city environment, attending a proper school, Living with your uncle who can provide professional education and opportunities you'll never have on a ranch? I don't care about those things. I care about being with my family. Your uncle is your family too. Blood family. Family is who you choose, Eli said firmly, sounding far older than 7. Who chooses you back? Uncle Thomas didn't choose us. He's just trying to use us. Pa chose us because he wanted us, and we chose him because he's good and kind, and he loves us even though he didn't have to. Out of the mouths of babes, Will thought, feeling something break open in his chest. But Whitmore just smiled sadly, like Eli was a confused child who didn't understand his own best interests. The testimony continued for hours. The social reformer argued that farm labor stunted children's development and limited their future prospects. Harrison's rebuttal witnesses, other homesteaders with children, testified that work was a natural part of rural childhood and built character rather than destroying it. Finally, Judge Caldwell called for closing arguments. Whitmore stood and delivered a passionate speech about protecting vulnerable children from exploitation, about the importance of education and opportunity, about how blood ties and family responsibility mattered in a civilized society. Then Harrison stood, and Will saw him take a deep breath before speaking. Your Honor, this case isn't really about child labor laws or homesteading regulations. It's about power and control. Thomas Brennan didn't want these children when they were starving and homeless. He didn't want them when they needed him most. He wants them now because someone else proved they were worth wanting, and his pride can't tolerate that. Harrison gestured to where Marin and Eli sat. These children aren't being exploited. They're being raised. They're learning responsibility, self-sufficiency, and the value of hard work. Yes, they contribute to the household, just like every child in every farming family across this territory. That's not exploitation, that's life. Harrison's voice grew stronger. Mr. Holt didn't take these children in to meet some homesteading requirement. He hadn't even filed for additional land when they arrived. He took them in because they needed help, and he had help to give, even though he was drowning in his own grief. They saved each other. And now Mr. Brennan wants to destroy that because it offends his sense of entitlement to children he never cared about until someone else did. He paused, looking directly at Judge Caldwell. This court needs to decide what matters more, the letter of laws designed to protect children, or the spirit of those laws, which is to ensure children are safe, loved, and given the chance to thrive. Because by every meaningful measure, Marin and Eli Brennan are thriving with William Holt. Taking them from the only stable home they've known would be the real cruelty here. Judge Caldwell sat silent for a long moment, her expression unreadable. Then she spoke. I'm going to review all testimony and evidence overnight. This court will reconvene at 9 o'clock tomorrow morning for my ruling. Until then, temporary custody remains with Mr. Holt. She looked at Marin and Eli. Children, you're excused. The gavel came down, and it was over. For now. That night in the hotel room they could barely afford, Will lay awake, listening to the unfamiliar sounds of the city. Marin and Eli slept in one bed, Mrs. Peterson in the other, while Will had taken a blanket to the floor. He stared at the ceiling and tried not to think about what would happen if they lost. But he couldn't help it. If Caldwell ruled against them, Brennan would take the children immediately. Will would have no recourse, no appeal that wouldn't take months or years. Marin and Eli would disappear into Kansas City, into whatever scheme Brennan had planned for them, and Will would be powerless to stop it. He'd survived losing Catherine and their unborn child. He wasn't sure he'd survive losing these children too. Somewhere around 3 in the morning, he felt someone settle beside him on the floor. Marin wrapped in a blanket, her eyes reflecting what little light came through the window. "Can't sleep either?" she whispered. "No." They sat in silence for a while, then Marin spoke again. "If we lose tomorrow, we're not going to lose. But if we do," she insisted, "I need you to promise me something. Anything. Don't give up. Don't go back to how you were when we found you." Her voice cracked. "Even if we can't be there, you have to keep living. Keep the ranch going. Be there if we ever find a way back." Will pulled her into a hug, this fierce child who worried about him, even facing her own nightmare. "I promise," he said, "but it's not going to come to that. We're going to win." "How do you know?" "Because losing isn't an option, not for any of us." Morning came too fast and too slow. They dressed in silence. forced down breakfast none of them wanted, and made their way back to the courthouse. The gallery was packed again. Word had spread about the case, and people were invested in the outcome one way or another. Judge Caldwell entered precisely at 9, took her seat, and opened the file in front of her. "I've reviewed all testimony and evidence presented in this matter," she began, her voice formal and detached. "This is a complex case that touches on fundamental questions about family, labor, and the rights of children." Will's heart hammered against his ribs. The petitioner has raised legitimate concerns about the use of child labor in homesteading operations. These concerns deserve serious consideration. Caldwell paused. "However, after careful review, I find that the evidence does not support a finding of exploitation or abuse in this case." Will felt Marin grab his hand, squeezing tight. The children's testimony was clear and convincing. They are not only well cared for, but actively thriving in Mr. Holt's custody. The work they perform is age-appropriate, properly supervised, and balanced with education and leisure time. Their contribution to the household is no different from that of millions of other farm children across this nation. Caldwell's eyes moved to Thomas Brennan. "Furthermore, I find the petitioner's motivations questionable. His sudden interest in these children's welfare, appearing only after they had established a stable home elsewhere, suggests opportunism rather than genuine familial concern." Brennan's face went purple, but his lawyer kept him seated. "Therefore," Caldwell continued, "I am denying the petition to terminate Mr. Holt's guardianship. Custody of Marin Elizabeth Brennan and Eli James Brennan shall remain with William Holt. Furthermore, I am ordering that Mr. Thomas Brennan shall have no further contact with these children unless they, upon reaching the age of majority, choose to seek him out." The gavel came down like thunder. "Court is adjourned." The gallery erupted in applause and exclamations, but Will heard none of it. He was too busy being crushed in a hug by two children who were sobbing with relief, while Mrs. Peterson stood behind them with tears streaming down her weathered face. They'd won. They'd actually won. Thomas Brennan stormed out of the courtroom, his lawyers trailing behind, but Will didn't care. Let him rage. Let him plot. It didn't matter anymore. The law had spoken, and the children were his. The ride back to the ranch felt different than the ride to Grand Island had felt. Then they'd been tense and fearful, carrying the weight of possible loss. Now they were light, almost giddy with relief and the knowledge that they were permanent. They were a family, sanctioned by law and sealed by choice, and nothing could change that now. When they crested the final rise and the homestead came into view, humble buildings and newly planted fields stretching toward the horizon, Will felt something settle deep in his bones. This was home. Not because of the land or the structures, but because of the people who'd chosen to build a life here together. A widow who'd lost everything and found purpose. Two children who'd been abandoned and found belonging. A man who'd been dying and found a reason to live. They'd all saved each other. And that, Will thought, as they rode into the yard with the evening sun painting everything gold, was the only kind of salvation that really mattered. The summer of 1882 arrived with a gentleness that felt like a gift after everything they'd survived. The wheat came in strong and golden, bowing under its own weight when the wind swept across the fields. The corn stood tall in neat rows that Eli had helped plant, each stalk a testament to careful tending and favorable weather. Even the garden flourished beyond anything Mrs. Peterson had hoped for, producing enough vegetables that they'd be canning and preserving well into autumn. The land grant had been approved without further challenge, and Will worked the new acreage with a sense of purpose that had replaced the desperate grief of 2 years prior. He still thought about Catherine, probably always would, but the memories had softened into something he could carry without being crushed by the weight. She was part of his past, woven into who he'd been. But this family, this strange assembled collection of souls, was his present and his future. Marin had turned 11 in June, and with the milestone came a maturity that sometimes startled Will. She could manage the household finances now, keeping careful records of expenses and income in a ledger Mrs. Peterson had given her. She understood crop rotation and soil management, could diagnose a sick animal with reasonable accuracy, and had started making decisions about ranch operations that Will trusted implicitly. She was growing into someone remarkable, and he couldn't take credit for it. She'd always had that strength inside her. He'd just given her space to let it flourish. Eli was 8 now, No longer the silent, terrified child who'd clutched a burlap sack like it held his whole world. He talked constantly, asking questions about everything from why the sky was blue to whether they could try raising sheep next year. His bond with the horses had deepened into genuine skill. He could gentle a spooked animal with patience and quiet words, could spot lameness or illness before Will did, had an instinct for reading equine behavior that couldn't be taught. The boy who'd barely spoken now narrated his entire day to anyone who'd listen. Mrs. Peterson had fully claimed her place as the heart of their household. Her health had stabilized after the scare in winter, and though she moved more carefully than before, she remained the steady presence that kept everything running smoothly. She'd started teaching both children more advanced lessons, history and literature, basic Latin, even some philosophy. She had ambitions for them that extended beyond ranch work, dreams of education and opportunity that made Will simultaneously proud and terrified of the day they might outgrow this place. But that was years away. For now, they were his, and he was theirs, and that was enough. One evening in late July, Will was on the porch oiling harness leather when a rider appeared on the horizon. He tensed instinctively. Visitors still made him wary after the battles with Thomas Brennan, but as the figure drew closer, Will recognized the horse, if not the rider. It was the widow Anderson's mare, but the person in the saddle was too small to be the widow herself. The rider resolved into a girl, maybe 14 or 15, thin as a rail, and sitting the horse like she'd been born to it. She had dark hair pulled back in a severe braid and eyes that reminded Will uncomfortably of Marin's when she'd first arrived. Hard, measuring, trusting nothing. "Help you?" Will called as she approached. The girl reined in the mare, looked him over with an assessment that felt invasive. "You Will Holt?" "I am. Heard you take in strays." Will set down the leather, stood slowly. Behind him, he heard the kitchen door open, Marin coming to investigate. "Depends on the stray and the circumstances." "Well, here's my circumstance." The girl's voice was flat, matter of fact. "Name's Rebecca Harris. My pa died 3 months back, and my stepmother made it clear she's got no use for me now that there's no man to keep her honest. Turned me out last week with nothing but what I'm wearing and this horse I stole from her barn." "You stole a horse?" Will's eyebrows rose. That was a hanging offense in most of the territory. "She stole my inheritance first. Figure it's a fair trade." Rebecca's chin came up. "Mrs. Anderson said you might have work for someone willing to do it. Said you've got a soft spot for people who need a second chance." Will felt Marin step up beside him, sensed her curiosity and wariness in equal measure. "Rebecca, is it?" he asked. "Yes, sir." "You know anything about ranch work?" "I can ride, rope, shoot, and work cattle better than most men twice my size. My pa saw to that before he died." She paused. "I can also cook, sew, and read well enough to help with bookkeeping if you need it. I'm not afraid of hard work, Mr. Holt. I'm just afraid of being sent back to a woman who'd rather see me dead than remind her of a man she never loved." It was the most emotion she'd shown, that last sentence, and it told Will everything he needed to know about what she was running from. He looked at Marin, saw his own thoughts reflected in her eyes. Another lost soul, another mouth to feed, another complication in a life that had just started to settle into manageable patterns. "You hungry?" he asked Rebecca. She blinked, thrown by the question. "Yes, sir. Been living on wild berries for 3 days." "Then come inside. We'll get you fed and figure out the rest after." Will gestured toward the house. "Mrs. Peterson's our housekeeper. She'll get you settled." Rebecca dismounted with the economical grace of someone who'd spent a lifetime on horseback. She followed them into the house, eyes darting around like she was memorizing escape routes, and Will felt the strange déjà vu of watching another broken person walk into their lives. Mrs. Peterson took one look at the girl and shifted immediately into maternal mode, clucking over her thinness and the bruise yellowing on her jaw that she'd tried to hide with her hair. Within minutes, Rebecca was seated at the table with a bowl of stew and a cup of water, eating with the controlled desperation of someone who'd learned not to take food for granted. Eli watched her with open fascination. Marin watched with something more guarded, recognition, maybe, or the wariness of someone protecting territory they'd fought hard to claim. After Rebecca had eaten and Mrs. Peterson had shown her to the barn where she could sleep until they figured out something more permanent, Will found Marin on the porch staring out at the darkening prairie. "You're taking her in," Marin said. Not a question. "Looks that way." "Just like that?" "We don't know anything about her. She could be lying, could be dangerous." "She could be," Will agreed. "You think she is?" Marin was quiet for a long moment. "No, I think she's like we were, desperate and scared and trying not to show it." "That's what I think, too." "It changes things, though, having someone else here. Someone older, more capable." Marin's voice dropped. "What if you decide you don't need me anymore? That Rebecca can do everything I do but better?" Will turned to look at her fully, this child who still carried fears that no amount of reassurance could fully erase. "Marin, look at me." She did, reluctantly. "You are not replaceable. Not by Rebecca. Not by anyone. You're my daughter in every way that matters, and nothing changes that. Not another person showing up, not you getting older, not anything." He put a hand on her shoulder. "Rebecca needs help. That doesn't mean you're less needed. It means we've got room to help one more person. That's all." "You sure about that?" "I'm sure about you. The rest we'll figure out together." Marin nodded slowly, some of the tension easing from her shoulders. "She's gonna need clothes, boots that fit, probably medical attention for whatever caused that bruise." "Probably," Will agreed. "I can help with that. Show her around, explain how things work here." Marin paused. "Make sure she knows the rules." "What rules are those?" "That this is a family, not just a work arrangement. That we take care of each other. That running away when things get hard isn't an option anymore." Marin's voice was fierce. "That she's safe here, but she's also responsible here. That we don't tolerate stealing or lying or cruelty." Will felt that familiar swell of pride. "Those sound like good rules." "They should be. You taught them to me." They stood together watching stars emerge in the vast Nebraska sky, and Will thought about how strange and wonderful it was that their family kept expanding in ways he never anticipated. First the children, then Mrs. Peterson, now Rebecca. Like the house itself was a living thing that drew in the wounded and the lost, giving them space to heal and grow. Maybe that was its purpose. Maybe that was enough. Rebecca settled in over the following weeks with a combination of fierce competence and carefully maintained distance. She was good with the horses. Better than good, actually, with an intuitive understanding of animal behavior that matched Eli's. She could rope and ride with a skill that surprised Will, and she threw herself into the work with an intensity that reminded him of Marin's early days, like she was trying to prove her worth every moment of every day. But she kept herself separate emotionally, polite but remote, helpful but guarded. She slept in the barn even after Mrs. Peterson had prepared a proper bed in the house, claiming she preferred it. She ate meals with them but contributed little to conversation. She worked alongside them but maintained an invisible barrier that said clearly, "I'm here, but I'm not staying. Don't get attached." Will recognized the defense mechanism. Had lived it himself for 18 months after Catherine died. But recognition didn't make it easier to navigate, especially when he saw how it confused Eli and frustrated Marin. "She doesn't want to be part of the family," Marin complained one evening when Rebecca had declined to join them for supper, claiming she wasn't hungry. "She just wants to use us until something better comes along." "Give her time," Mrs. Peterson counseled. "Some people need longer to learn how to trust." "We didn't get time. We had to trust or die. And that shaped you in certain ways, made you strong but also hard sometimes." Mrs. Peterson's tone was gentle. "Rebecca's been shaped differently. Her wounds are different. They'll heal differently." "If they heal at all," Marin muttered, but she stopped pushing. The truth revealed itself in pieces over the following month. Rebecca's father had been a rancher with substantial holdings, and when he died suddenly, everything should have passed to Rebecca as his only child. But the stepmother had moved quickly, producing a will that left everything to her and claiming Rebecca was illegitimate, not entitled to inheritance. The territorial court had sided with the stepmother, and Rebecca had been cast out with nothing. "She wanted me gone because I could challenge her claim," Rebecca told Will one evening when they were working late to bring in hay before a storm. "Easier to erase me entirely than risk me finding proof my father actually married my mother before she died." "You think such proof exists?" I know it does. My father kept a Bible with the marriage record in it and letters from the preacher who performed the ceremony, but the stepmother destroyed them after he died, burned everything that connected me to him. Rebecca's voice was bitter. So legally, I don't exist. I'm just a stray bastard with delusions of inheritance. Legally doesn't mean actually, Will said quietly. You know who you are. That's what matters. Does it? Because knowing who I am doesn't get me back what was stolen, doesn't give me the life I should have had. She threw another bale onto the wagon with unnecessary force. I appreciate what you're doing here, Mr. Holt, truly, but I'm not staying forever. Soon as I can save enough to move on, maybe head to California or Oregon, where nobody knows my history, I'm gone. Fair enough. But while you're here, you're part of this family. That means you eat at the table, sleep in the house, and stop treating yourself like hired help. Rebecca's jaw set stubbornly. I prefer the barn. And I prefer not having to explain to people why we make a 14-year-old girl sleep with the animals when we've got perfectly good beds inside. Will met her eyes. You've been hurt. I understand that. But punishing yourself by living like you're not worth basic dignity isn't going to fix what was taken from you. You don't know what will fix it. No, I don't. But I know isolation and self-imposed exile aren't the answer, because I tried that route myself. Didn't work. Will softened his tone. I'm not asking you to trust us completely or commit to staying forever. I'm just asking you to stop sleeping in the barn and come to supper. Can you do that much? Rebecca looked away, her throat working. What if I get comfortable and then have to leave? What if I let myself believe this is real and it turns out to be temporary? Then you'll have had something good for however long it lasted. That's better than nothing. She was quiet for a long moment, then nodded once. I'll try. It was a start. August brought the final push of summer, harvest in full swing, preserving and canning occupying Mrs. Peterson and Marin from dawn to dark, every hand needed for the work that would determine whether they ate well through winter or scraped by. Rebecca threw herself into the labor with the same fierce intensity she brought to everything, and slowly, almost imperceptibly, the walls around her began to crack. It started with small things. She moved her bedroll into the house, taking the small room off the kitchen that had been used for storage. She began arriving to meals on time instead of late, or not at all. She started responding to Eli's endless questions with actual answers instead of grunts. She helped Marin with the ledgers one evening and made a suggestion about crop pricing that would save them considerable money. By the time September arrived with its cooling temperatures and changing leaves, Rebecca had become part of the daily rhythm of the household. Not quite family yet, but not a stranger either. Something in between, finding her place. The first real test came on a Tuesday morning when a stranger rode into the yard asking after Rebecca Harris. Will was mending fence when he saw the man approach, middle-aged, well-dressed, with the look of someone employed to ask uncomfortable questions. His instincts prickled immediately. Help you? Will called. I'm looking for Rebecca Harris. Been told she might be working here. Who's asking? Name's Porter. I'm a land agent working for Mrs. Clara Harris of the Harris Creek Ranch. The man's expression was professionally neutral. Mrs. Harris would like her stepdaughter returned to discuss matters of the estate. Rebecca's not interested in discussions with the woman who stole her inheritance. Porter's eyebrows rose. I see the girl's been telling stories. Mrs. Harris assured me Rebecca was prone to fantasy and fabrication. And I'm sure Mrs. Harris tells a very convincing story about being the victim here. Will set down his tools, moved to block the path to the house where he could see Rebecca frozen in the doorway. But Rebecca's legal age to choose where she lives and who she associates with. If she wanted to talk to her stepmother, she knows where to find her. Mrs. Harris is prepared to offer compensation for Rebecca's return, a finder's fee, if you will. Rebecca's not lost property to be returned for a fee. Will's voice went cold. She's a person who's made her choice. You can tell Mrs. Harris that her stepdaughter is staying right where she is. Porter's professional mask slipped slightly. Mr. Holt, I'd advise you not to interfere in family matters. Mrs. Harris has considerable resources and connections. Making an enemy of her would be unwise. Seems like I've got experience making enemies of people with resources and connections. Survived it so far. Will crossed his arms. But here's what I'll tell you for free. If, Mrs. Harris or anyone acting on her behalf sets foot on this property again, they'll be met with a shotgun and the full support of the territorial sheriff, who's a personal friend and doesn't take kindly to people harassing children. We clear?" Porter's jaw tightened. "Perfectly. But this isn't over, Mr. Holt. Mrs. Harris doesn't give up easily." "Neither do I. Now get off my land." The agent rode away, and Will turned to find Rebecca standing on the porch with tears streaming down her face. "She's never going to leave me alone, is she?" Rebecca's voice was small, younger than her years. "She's going to keep coming until she destroys me or makes me disappear completely." Will climbed the porch steps, stood beside her. "Maybe, but she's going to have to go through me first, through all of us." He gestured to where Marin and Eli had emerged from the barn, and Mrs. Peterson stood in the doorway. "You're not alone anymore, Rebecca. That changes the equation." "Why do you care? I'm nothing to you, just another mouth to feed." "You're a child who deserves better than what you got. That makes you everything to me." Will said it simply, stating fact. "I know what it's like to want to disappear because living hurts too much, but I also know that having people who refuse to let you disappear makes all the difference." Rebecca wiped her eyes roughly. "I don't know how to do this. How to be part of something. How to trust that it won't be taken away." "None of us did at first," Marin said, joining them on the porch. "But we figured it out together. You will too. And if my stepmother makes trouble, if she brings lawyers then we fight her the same way we fought Marin and Eli's uncle," Will interrupted, "with the truth, with witnesses, with every legal tool we can access. You think we're scared of one more battle after everything we've survived?" Rebecca looked at them, this impossible family that had formed around pain and loss and the stubborn refusal to give up on each other. And something in her face shifted. The walls didn't come down entirely, but a door opened. Just a crack, but enough. "Okay," she whispered. "Okay." The threatened legal battle with Clara Harris never materialized. Either Porter's report about Will's determination discouraged her, or she decided Rebecca wasn't worth the effort now that the girl had protection and witnesses. Either way, no more agents appeared, no lawyers sent threatening letters, and Rebecca began to truly settle. October brought the first hard frost, and with it the knowledge that they'd made it through another cycle. The harvest had been good, better than good actually. The additional acreage had produced beyond expectations, and their livestock had thrived through summer. Financially, they were more stable than they'd ever been. The work had been brutal, the hours endless, but they'd survived it together. One evening, Will called everyone to the kitchen table. He'd been thinking about something for weeks, and it was time to make it official. "I've been doing some planning," he said once they were all seated, "about the future of this place." "What kind of planning?" Marin asked. "Legal planning. I went to see a lawyer last week about drawing up a will and establishing proper ownership structure for the ranch." Will pulled out papers, spread them on the table. "Right now, everything's in my name. If something happened to me, you'd be vulnerable. So I'm creating a trust that divides ownership of this ranch equally among the four of you." Mrs. Peterson's hand went to her mouth. "William, you can't." "I can, and I did. You're all family. You've all put work and heart into this place. You deserve to know it's yours too, legally and binding." He looked at each of them in turn. "Marin, Eli, you're my children. This is your inheritance. Rebecca, you've earned your place here. And Mrs. Peterson, you've been the foundation that kept us all standing. This ranch belongs to all of us. But the land grant, the original homestead, all of it's yours," Marin started. "Was mine. Now it's ours. That's how family works." Will pushed the papers toward them. "I'm not planning on dying anytime soon, but if I do, I want to know you're all protected, that this place can't be taken from you by someone with a legal claim or deep pockets." Eli was crying quietly, his small shoulders shaking. Rebecca stared at the papers like they might disappear if she looked away. Mrs. Peterson had her hand pressed to her chest, overcome. "There's one more thing," Will said. "I've filed papers to formally adopt Marin and Eli. Make it legal beyond guardianship. And Rebecca, if you're willing, I'd like to do the same for you. Make you a Holton name as well as fact." The silence stretched long and heavy. Then Rebecca spoke, her voice breaking. "My father's name was Harris. I'm his daughter. I spent my whole life fighting to prove that connection mattered." "And it does matter," Will said gently. "If you want to keep his name, I understand. But you can be a Harris and a Holt. Both truths can exist." "Rebecca Harris Holt," she whispered, testing it. That sounds right. Then that's what we'll do." Will looked around the table at these people who'd become his whole world. "We're a family. We have been for a while. This just makes it official." They sat together as darkness fell outside. 4 people who'd been broken in different ways, finding wholeness in each other, and Will thought about how far they'd all come. From desperate survival to this moment of chosen commitment, from alone to together, from barely living to building a future. It was more than he'd dared hope for when Marin and Eli had walked out of the summer heat 18 months ago. It was everything. The adoption papers were finalized in November, making Will officially the father of 3 children ranging from 8 to 14. The lawyer who processed the paperwork commented that he'd never seen such an unusual family configuration, and Will had just smiled and said nothing about it was usual, which was exactly the point. December brought the holidays again, their second Christmas together, and this time they had enough to celebrate properly. Mrs. Peterson made a feast with supplies they could actually afford. Will had saved enough to buy small gifts, a new rifle for Rebecca, who'd been using a borrowed one, books for Marin, who devoured them faster than they could acquire them, a real saddle for Eli to replace the makeshift one he'd been using. For Mrs. Peterson, he commissioned a rocking chair from the carpenter in town, built from good oak and sized perfectly for her frame. When she saw it on Christmas morning, she wept openly. "It's too much," she protested. "It's not nearly enough," Will countered. "You gave us a home when this was just a house. You gave us stability when we were barely holding together. You gave us family. A chair's nothing compared to that." They spent the day together in companionable chaos. Too much food, too much laughter, the kind of noise and warmth that Catherine would have loved. Will felt her presence like a blessing rather than a haunting, like she was glad he'd found a way forward even though it looked nothing like what they'd planned. As winter deepened and they settled into the quiet months when outside work was limited and they lived mostly in the warm kitchen, Will noticed changes in all of them. Marin was growing into young womanhood, her interests expanding beyond just ranch management to include questions about the wider world. She'd started talking about maybe attending normal school in town next year, just to see what it was like, and Will encouraged it even though the thought of her leaving daily terrified him. Eli had developed a passion for drawing, sketching horses and cattle with surprising skill in the margins of his schoolwork. Mrs. Peterson had ordered proper art supplies for him, and he spent hours rendering the ranch and its inhabitants in careful detail. He talked less about becoming a rancher and more about maybe documenting the West through pictures, capturing what would soon be gone as civilization encroached. Rebecca had softened in ways Will hadn't expected. She laughed more, argued less, had stopped treating every kindness like a trap. She'd started teaching Eli advanced writing techniques and working with Marin on financial planning, her sharp mind finding purpose in helping the family thrive. She still talked occasionally about leaving, but with less conviction, like maybe she was starting to believe she could have a future here. Mrs. Peterson continued her quiet stewardship of them all, teaching and guiding and making sure they became not just survivors, but educated, thoughtful people who could hold their own in any company. And Will, for the first time since Catherine died, felt something like contentment. Spring came again in 1883 with the promise of renewal. They planted the same fields, worked the same rhythms, but everything felt different because they knew now that it would endure. This wasn't temporary survival, this was permanent building. The ranch had a future because they had committed to it together. One warm April afternoon, Will was on the porch when he saw a wagon approaching. Not unusual, they had neighbors now, people who stopped by to trade goods or share news. But as the wagon drew closer, Will recognized the driver as Judge Caldwell, the woman who'd ruled in their favor against Thomas Brennan. He stood to greet her, curious and slightly wary. "Judge," he said as she pulled up. "This is unexpected." "Mr. Holt?" She climbed down from the wagon with the careful movements of someone who'd spent too long traveling. "I hope you'll forgive the intrusion. I was in the area and wanted to see for myself how you and the children were faring." "We're doing well, more than well, actually." Will called toward the house. "Marin! Eli! Come say hello to Judge Caldwell." The children emerged, followed by Rebecca and Mrs. Peterson, and Will watched as Caldwell's stern expression softened at the sight of them. They were clean, healthy, clearly thriving, exactly what she'd hoped to see when she'd ruled in their favor. "Would you like to see the ranch?" Marin offered. "We've expanded since the court case. Got the land grant approved and everything." "I'd love to," Caldwell said. They gave her the tour, showed her the fields now green with spring wheat, the expanded barn, the chicken coop that had tripled in size, the new well they'd dug on the far section. They introduced her to Sadie and the other horses, showed her Eli's drawings, let her see the kitchen garden that Mrs. Peterson was already planting for the season. When they returned to the porch, Caldwell accepted a cup of coffee and sat in Mrs. Peterson's rocking chair with a sigh. "You've built something impressive here," she said. "Not just the physical structures, but the family itself. I see children who are educated, confident, secure. That's not always the outcome in these situations." "We've been lucky," Will said. "Luck has nothing to do with it. This is hard work and commitment, the kind that makes me believe I made the right decision last year." She paused. "I should tell you, Thomas Brennan died 3 months ago. Heart failure, according to the reports. I thought you should know there's no possibility of him renewing his claim." Will felt something release in his chest that he hadn't realized he'd been carrying. "Thank you for telling us. The reason I mention it is because his estate is being settled, and apparently there's a small bequest for Marin and Eli. Their father's pocket watch and their mother's wedding ring, items that should have gone to them originally. The estate lawyer wanted to know where to send them." Marin and Eli exchanged glances, processing this information. "We'll accept them," Marin said quietly. "Not because we want anything from him, but because they belong to our parents. They matter." "I thought you might feel that way." Caldwell reached into her bag, pulled out a small wrapped package. "I took the liberty of bringing them with me. Saved the estate the postage." She handed the package to Marin, who unwrapped it carefully to reveal a silver pocket watch and a simple gold band. Marin held the ring up to the light, and Will saw tears tracking down her cheeks. "Mama wore this every day," she whispered, "even when she was sick and her fingers got so thin it barely stayed on." Eli touched the pocket watch with reverent fingers. "Papa used to let me wind it. Said someday it would be mine." "Now it is," Will said gently. "Both of you have pieces of them to keep." Judge Caldwell stood, prepared to leave. "I won't take up more of your time. I just wanted to see with my own eyes that the decision I made was the right one. And I can see that it was." She looked at Will directly. "You've done well by these children, Mr. Holt. Better than I dared hope." "They did well by me first," Will said honestly. "I'm just returning the favor." After Caldwell left, they gathered on the porch and watched the sunset paint the sky in brilliant colors. Marin held her mother's ring, Eli his father's watch, both of them processing what it meant to have these tangible connections to parents they'd lost. "I want to remember them," Eli said suddenly. "Our real parents. But I also want this to be real. Pa, Mrs. Peterson, Rebecca, all of it. Can both things be true?" "Both things are true," Will said firmly. "Your first parents gave you life and loved you as long as they could. We're giving you the rest. The growing up, the future, the family you'll have going forward. None of that erases what came before. It builds on it." "Like layers," Marin said thoughtfully. "Each one mattering, each one part of who we are." "Exactly like that." They sat together as stars began appearing overhead, this family built from loss and choice, and Will thought about how perfect it all was in its imperfection. They'd never be conventional, would always be the odd household that tongues wagged about in town. But they were theirs, chosen, committed, permanent. That was worth more than any conventional arrangement could ever be. Summer rolled in with work that never ended, but somehow felt lighter than before. They had help now. Rebecca's skill with horses made her invaluable, and they'd hired a ranch hand named Tom, who worked hard and asked few questions about their unusual family dynamic. The crops were thriving, the animals healthy, and financially they were stable enough to start thinking about improvements beyond basic survival. Will bought glass windows to replace the oiled paper in 2 rooms. Mrs. Peterson ordered books from back east for the children's education. They built a proper bunkhouse for Tom and any future hands they might employ, giving everyone more space and privacy. The ranch was becoming something substantial, and with it came opportunities. The territorial government was talking about statehood, which would mean better roads, more commerce, greater security. Towns were growing, railroads expanding. The West was changing from wild frontier to settled civilization, and they were positioned to benefit from that transition. One evening in late August, Will gathered everyone for a family meeting. They'd been doing this regularly now, making decisions together, rather than Will dictating from on high. "I've been approached about selling beef to the railroad," he said. "It's a big contract, guaranteed income for the next 3 years. But it would mean expanding the herd, which means more work, more risk, more investment." "What's the alternative?" Rebecca asked. "We stay as we are, comfortable but not growing, safe but not ambitious." Marin leaned forward. "What do you think we should do?" "I think we should decide together. This ranch belongs to all of us. The future we build should reflect all our goals." They discussed for over an hour, weighing pros and cons, talking through fears and aspirations. Eli worried about having less time for his art. Marin worried about overextending financially. Rebecca worried about change disrupting what they'd built. But Mrs. Peterson, quiet through most of the discussion, finally spoke up. "You're all talking about risks," she said. "But the biggest risk is standing still when opportunity knocks. We've survived hard things, loss, grief, legal battles, winters that tried to kill us. We can survive growth too. And maybe it's time to stop just surviving and start thriving." Her words hung in the air, simple and true. "All in favor of accepting the railroad contract?" Will asked. 4 hands went up, Eli's a bit slower but eventually joining the others. "Then we're doing this," Will said. "Together." The next months were chaotic as they expanded operations. They bought more cattle, hired another hand, built additional corrals and storage. Everyone worked until exhaustion was a daily state, but there was energy to it now, purpose beyond mere endurance. Rebecca proved herself invaluable in the expansion, her experience from her father's ranch coming back as muscle memory. She could work cattle as well as any man, had an eye for quality livestock, and negotiated prices with traders like she'd been born to it. Marin took over more of the business side, handling contracts and correspondence with a precision that made Will grateful and slightly unnecessary. She was growing into someone who could run this operation without him, which was exactly what he'd hoped for, even as it made him feel old. Eli continued his art while also proving surprisingly adept at veterinary care, his gentle nature and careful observation making him the go-to for sick or injured animals. And through it all, Mrs. Peterson kept them fed, educated, and grounded, the steady heartbeat around which everything else revolved. By the time autumn arrived and the first cattle shipment went out on schedule and above quality standards, they knew they'd turned a corner. This wasn't just a ranch anymore. It was a legacy, something that would outlast all of them, that future generations might build on. One October evening, as the first snow of the season began to fall, Will stood on the porch looking out at land that had nearly killed him, and instead had saved him. Behind him, through the windows, he could see his family gathered around the kitchen table, Marin reading to Eli from a new book, Rebecca and Mrs. Peterson working on mending, the ordinary domestic scene of people who belong together. "Pa?" Eli called. "You coming in? Supper's ready?" Pa. That word still caught him sometimes, filled him with wonder and gratitude. "Coming," he called back. But he paused a moment longer, sending a silent thought to Catherine, wherever she might be. "I know this isn't what we planned, but I think you'd be proud of what we built anyway. I think you'd love them like I do." The wind carried snow across the prairie, cold but not bitter. And somewhere in its whisper, Will thought he heard agreement. Permission to be happy. Permission to live fully in this unexpected life. He went inside to his family, closing the door against the weather, sealing in warmth and light and the sound of voices he'd come to cherish more than anything else in the world. Years later, when people asked how the Holt Ranch became one of the most successful operations in the territory, when they marveled at the unusual family that ran it, Will would tell them the truth. He'd been dying when 2 children walked out of the summer heat looking for shelter. They'd saved him by giving him purpose. A widow had saved them all by giving them stability. A girl running from her past had saved herself by finding a future worth staying for. They were all strays, really, lost souls who'd found each other on the plains of Nebraska and decided that was enough to build a life on. And it turned out it was more than enough. It was everything they needed. The ranch prospered through the years that followed. Marin eventually went to school in the East, came back with ideas about modern ranching that transformed their operation. She never married, preferring instead to run the ranch with a combination of traditional wisdom and progressive innovation that made them leaders in the territory. Eli became a renowned illustrator, his drawings of frontier life sought after by magazines and collectors. But he always came home between commissions, contributing his share of labor and keeping his connection to the land that had healed him. Rebecca married the railroad agent who'd handled their contracts, a quiet man who appreciated her strength and supported her dream of reclaiming her father's legacy. She split her time between two ranches, the Holt Place and the restored Harris Creek property, making both flourish. Mrs. Peterson lived to 93, sharp and capable until the very end, surrounded by the family she'd helped build and the great-grandchildren who called her grandmother, even though no blood connected them. And Will? Will lived long enough to see Nebraska achieve statehood, to see the ranch become legendary, to see the children he'd taken in become remarkable adults who carried his name and his values into a changing world. He died in his sleep in the winter of 1903, peacefully and without pain, in the house where he'd once wanted to die alone, but instead had learned to live surrounded by love. They buried him next to Catherine, finally reunited after all those years apart. But the family he'd built, that strange, beautiful, assembled collection of hearts who'd chosen each other, continued thriving, honoring his memory by living fully and loving fiercely and keeping the ranch going for generations. Because that was the real legacy. Not the land or the cattle or the successful business, but the proof that family wasn't just about blood, that love could be chosen, that broken people could find wholeness in each other if they were brave enough to try. Will Holt had been dying when the children found him, but together they'd all learned how to live. And in the end, that was the only story that mattered.